Hey there, and welcome. Before we dive in, I'd love for you to tell me where you're rewatching from, and what time it is there. I always find it fascinating to see the world lighting up with this story. Tonight, we're going back over 4,000 years, to the lands of Sumer, nestled between the Tigris and Euphrates, where civilization first took shape, and where temples towered over mud-brick cities. It's a world that feels distant and strange, yet the fears, the power struggles, and the whispers of curses might feel uncomfortably familiar. We're going to explore the lives of the Sumerian priests, men and women who wielded authority over life, death, and the favor of the gods. To the people of their cities, they were divinely chosen, yet they were feared, resented, and sometimes cursed. They dictated the laws, interpreted omens, controlled the grain, and conducted rituals that could save a life or end one. Every gesture, every glance, every word held weight, and the ordinary citizen knew it. As you listen tonight, let yourself imagine the dust-choked streets, the towering ziggurats, and the hushed murmurs of villagers wary of angering the priesthood. We'll see how fear and reverence intertwined, how secrets kept in shadow shaped the lives of thousands, and why their stories linger as warnings, myths, and legends. So settle in, let your mind drift back through the millennia, and join me as we uncover why Sumerian priests were feared, hated, and cursed. The temples of Sumer were unlike anything most people could imagine today. Rising above the flat, dusty plains of Mesopotamia, they were more than buildings. They were the beating hearts of entire cities, centers of power, faith, and control. From the outside, a visitor might notice the towering ziggurats, their stepped terraces reaching toward the sky, brick by brick, with glazed tiles that caught the sunlight and reflected it in shimmering patterns. But the grandeur of the structure itself was only the beginning. It was what happened within and around these temples that made the Sumerian priests figures of immense influence and immense fear. Life in the city revolved around the temple. Each morning, as the sun rose over the Tigris and Euphrates, its first light glinting off the temple walls, the priests would begin their rituals, moving with deliberate precision, their voices raised in chants that echoed across the streets. These chants were not simply religious. They were a reminder of the priesthood's reach. The people believed that the gods themselves were listening, that every word, every gesture could alter the fortunes of crops, the health of livestock, and even the safety of their children. And it was the priests who held the key to that divine attention. They controlled the sacrifices, the offerings, and the prayers, deciding who was worthy of favor and who might endure the wrath of angry deities. In this, they were more than spiritual leaders. They were the ultimate arbiters of life and death in the minds of the people. The power of the temple extended far beyond the rituals themselves. Grain, the lifeblood of Sumerian cities, was stored in vast, secure silos attached to the temple complex. The priests oversaw these stores with meticulous care, deciding who would receive rations and how much, effectively controlling the very survival of the populace. A farmer might toil for months in the scorching sun, only to have his crop inspected and portioned by priests who could demand a larger offering than he expected. A family who displeased the temple officials might find their reserves withheld, leaving them vulnerable to hunger or social humiliation. The priests' authority over sustenance meant that they were not only feared for their connection to the divine, but also for their ability to wield very human, tangible power over life itself. Kings and city leaders, too, were not immune. Though a king could command armies and make laws, he could not act without the tacit support of the priesthood. Every royal decree required the temple's blessing. Every war or treaty needed ritual endorsement. The priest's influence was subtle yet pervasive. They understood the symbols of power, the gestures that mattered, and how to bend even kings to their will without overtly challenging them. Many rulers, eager to consolidate their authority, sought the approval of the temple, offering lavish gifts, performing public acts of piety, and sometimes even kneeling before the high priests to demonstrate humility. To deny the priests would be to risk public opinion, to risk the wrath of the gods, and, perhaps most frighteningly, to risk the perception that the king himself had lost divine favor. The fear the priests inspired was not abstract. Stories circulated throughout the cities of what could happen to those who crossed them. A merchant might find a shipment mysteriously delayed or destroyed. Rumors whispered that it was a priest's subtle punishment. A family might lose livestock overnight, the blame attributed to a neglected offering or a priest's disfavor. These tales were reinforced by the very architecture of Sumerian cities, which were designed to funnel the population past the temples, ensuring that the priest's presence was inescapable. The streets, often narrow and winding, led inevitably toward the ziggurat, and from every corner the temple could be seen, a looming reminder of authority. To live in Sumer was to live in a world where the priest's eyes could be upon you at any time, where disobedience could carry consequences both spiritual and mortal. But power breeds resentment as easily as obedience. Many people hated the priests, and the reasons were understandable. Their control over grain could turn survival into a lottery, with no guarantee that effort alone would be rewarded. Their rituals, often elaborate and exhausting, demanded offerings that the poor could scarcely afford. And while kings and nobles benefited from the priest's approval, the common people often bore the weight of these demands. Their labor and wealth funneled toward temples that towered over their homes, yet offered little in return except fear. Children grew up hearing warnings: speak properly to a priest, leave offerings on time, and never, under any circumstance, question their authority. Those who did often found themselves punished, not necessarily through physical harm, though that happened, but through ostracization, social humiliation, or subtle retribution that left them vulnerable in every aspect of daily life. The curse of the priests was often psychological as much as it was practical. People learned to self-police, to measure every word, every action against the invisible standards imposed by the temple. A glance too long at a sacred idol could be interpreted as disrespect. A failure to follow ritual precisely could be seen as a personal affront to the gods. In homes, in markets, in schools, and even on the streets, citizens lived with an acute awareness that any moment a priest might take notice, and that notice could change the course of their lives. The fear was omnipresent, and it became second nature. Parents warned children not only about thieves and wild animals, but about the unseen eyes of those who wielded spiritual authority. To survive in Sumer, people had to navigate a world where divine favor and human oversight were indistinguishable, and where the priest's power was absolute. Behind the veil of fear, though, the priests' lives were not simple either. The high priests carried immense responsibilities, from coordinating massive harvest offerings to interpreting the cryptic signs of the gods. They trained for years, memorizing chants, learning the sacred languages, and mastering the rituals that few others could perform. Mistakes were not tolerated, for an error in ceremony could have devastating consequences, or at least be perceived that way. The high priest's reputation was everything, and his authority depended not only on the performance of rituals, but on the maintenance of an aura of infallibility. The people's fear was thus both a tool and a burden. It reinforced their power, but it also demanded that they live under constant pressure to uphold the image of perfection. The temples themselves were centers of knowledge as well as power. Priests maintained records on clay tablets, documenting everything from trade agreements to astronomical observations. This made them indispensable to the functioning of the city-state, and it further entrenched their influence. Literacy was rare, and those who could read and write were elevated to a position of prominence. Citizens who sought justice, trade, or guidance had to rely on the priests to interpret the records, to mediate disputes, and to authenticate transactions. The temple's archives were more than mere information. They were instruments of control, ensuring that the priest's reach extended into almost every corner of civic life. Superstition reinforced the priest's authority. The people believed that the gods themselves were capricious, and that any misfortune, from a failed harvest to a sudden flood, was a direct result of divine displeasure. In this worldview, the priests were the only buffer, the only mediators capable of interpreting signs, appeasing the gods, and preventing disaster. Anyone who doubted or defied them risked being branded impious, inviting calamity not only upon themselves, but upon their entire community. Fear of collective punishment made disobedience nearly unthinkable, and the priest's ability to shape perception ensured that their power remained unchallenged. At night, the city might seem quiet, but the influence of the temple never waned. The glow of oil lamps illuminated sacred chambers, casting long shadows across the stone floors. Priests moved silently through corridors, chanting or performing tasks that maintained the rhythm of the city's spiritual life. For ordinary citizens, sleep was a temporary escape from vigilance. But even then, the thought of divine retribution and priestly oversight lingered. Dreams were often interpreted as omens, and many would rise in the night to make offerings or seek guidance to avoid perceived danger. The reach of the priests extended even into the most private corners of existence. It is easy to think of power as a static thing, held by kings and armies, but in Sumer, the real power was subtle, pervasive, and psychological. Priests shaped the daily lives, decisions, and even thoughts of the people. Their influence was reinforced by ritual, architecture, literacy, and the ever-present threat of divine wrath. They were feared, hated, and yet also depended upon. Without them, the cities could not function, crops might fail, and societal order could unravel. Their control was not maintained solely through force, but through a combination of religious belief, practical necessity, and the cultivation of awe and terror. In understanding the lives of Sumerian priests, we glimpse a society built on interdependence and fear. They were intermediaries between mortals and gods, custodians of sustenance, educators, record keepers, and enforcers of morality as dictated by divine mandate. Their power was enormous, their lives complex, and their influence indelible. Ordinary people lived in constant awareness of the priest's presence, measuring each action, each word, each glance against a standard that was invisible but omnipresent. And though many despised them, few dared openly challenge them. To understand Sumerian society is to understand how fear and reverence intertwined, and how those entrusted with divine knowledge could command obedience, shape civilization, and linger in history as figures both respected and reviled. The priests were, in every sense, the heart of Sumerian control. They inspired awe, enforced order, and dictated life's rhythm from birth to death. Their influence shaped politics, economics, religion, and even psychology. They were feared for their ability to manipulate both mortal and divine realms, hated for the inequalities and burdens they imposed, and cursed in stories that warned of the dangers of unchecked authority. And yet, for all the fear and resentment, society depended upon them. Their power was total, their presence unavoidable, and their legacy enduring. They remain one of the most fascinating examples of how belief, knowledge, and human psychology can combine to create authority that shapes the course of history. From the earliest age, children destined for the priesthood were set apart from the ordinary rhythms of life. Families who held hereditary ties to the temple would present their sons or, in some cases, daughters to the sanctified halls where knowledge and power intertwined. These children were not simply trained. They were initiated into a world that few could even imagine. Their days began before sunrise, often with ritual cleansing and silent meditation, and continued with lessons in writing, the sacred language of the gods, and the complex choreography of ceremonial rites. By the time their peers were learning to trade in the market or tend fields, these children were already memorizing hymns, mastering divinations, and observing the meticulous order that governed temple life. The distinction was immediate and profound. While ordinary children played in the dusty streets, these initiates were surrounded by the cool, echoing stone of the temple, the soft glow of oil lamps illuminating carved reliefs of deities and legendary kings. The air carried the scent of incense, mingled with the dust of clay tablets and the low murmur of prayers and chants. From the very first day, the novices understood that their lives were bound to something larger than themselves. Every action, every misstep, carried consequences not only for their education, but for their family's honor and, by extension, their city's fortune. Education in the temple was rigorous. The children were drilled in cuneiform, the wedge-shaped script that held the secrets of law, trade, and sacred knowledge. Each tablet they touched represented centuries of accumulated wisdom, yet mastery required precision and patience. Mistakes were not taken lightly. A poorly inscribed symbol could alter the meaning of a prayer, disrupt the balance of a ritual, or even be interpreted as disrespect toward the gods. Discipline was ingrained in every lesson, every repetition, every line scratched into clay under the watchful eyes of the elder priests. For many, the fear of failure was nearly as potent as the desire to excel. But writing alone was only the beginning. The children were immersed in ritual. They learned the correct offerings to present, the exact angles at which to pour libations, the appropriate words and tones for chants that invoked the gods' attention. Movements had to be precise. Timing had to align with the cycles of the sun, the moon, and the stars. Deviating even slightly could be seen as an error in judgment, a potential offense to the divine. To the untrained eye, these ceremonies might have seemed overly elaborate or even theatrical. But within the temple walls, they were a language of power, a means to assert control over life, harvests, and fortune. Alongside literacy and ritual training came lessons in observation and interpretation. Divination, the art of reading omens and deciphering the will of the gods, was central to the priestly role. Children were taught to observe patterns in the stars, the flight of birds, the entrails of sacrificed animals, and even the behavior of the city's inhabitants. From these signs, they would predict outcomes, guide leaders, and influence decisions. The ability to interpret such omens was as much a psychological tool as it was a spiritual practice. Through this, young priests learned that knowledge was not just power, it was influence, subtle yet irresistible, extending from the temple into every facet of Sumerian life. The separation from ordinary society reinforced the sense of authority that would accompany them throughout their lives. Playmates from the streets could not enter the temple grounds, and curiosity alone was not sufficient to gain access. Even the families of the novices were bound by rules of reverence and protocol. A father or mother could not freely visit the training halls for fear of contaminating the sanctity of the space. This isolation instilled both discipline and a sense of superiority. The children began to internalize the belief that their purpose was greater than that of ordinary citizens, and that obedience, secrecy, and meticulous attention to detail were the keys to survival and eventual influence. Yet this training was not solely intellectual or spiritual. It was also physical and psychological. Ritual fasting, long hours of standing during ceremonies, and the demanding physical labor of maintaining the temple spaces conditioned them for endurance. Silence was enforced during observation periods, teaching patience and the ability to watch and understand without speaking. Mistakes were met with correction, often public and severe, ensuring that the novice learned quickly that accountability was paramount. Through repetition and ritualized discipline, the young priests were molded into individuals capable of withstanding scrutiny, managing fear, and commanding respect, qualities that would define them as they moved into positions of authority. As the children grew older, their immersion in temple life intensified. They were introduced to the sacred stories of the gods, learning not only the myths themselves, but the correct interpretation and application of those tales to daily life. They studied the interactions between gods and humans, the lessons of divine favor and wrath, and the consequences of moral or ritual failings. Knowledge of these stories was not mere academic exercise. It was a blueprint for guiding the populace. A priest who could reference these narratives with authority could sway opinion, enforce compliance, and maintain social order, all while reinforcing the perception that the gods themselves were actively involved in the lives of mortals. The hierarchical structure of the temple further reinforced obedience and ambition. Young priests were assigned mentors, often elder priests whose reputations were impeccable and whose knowledge was vast. These mentors monitored every aspect of training, providing instruction and correction, but also subtly teaching the importance of political acumen. Understanding the subtle dynamics between different factions within the temple was crucial. A misstep could result in humiliation, loss of privilege, or being sidelined entirely. The novices learned that knowledge alone was insufficient. Skill in navigating relationships, alliances, and rivalries within the sacred hierarchy was equally vital. By adolescence, the initiated priests were expected to perform rituals under supervision, a test of their competence and poise. Every gesture, every recitation, every action had consequences. The mistakes of youth could become lessons for future success, but they also served as stark reminders that the temple's expectations were absolute. These early experiences cultivated a profound understanding of both the power and the danger inherent in their vocation. It was a world where influence was tightly bound to precision, where respect was earned through mastery, and where fear of divine or human retribution ensured compliance. As they reached adulthood, the priests were fully integrated into the temple's operations. Their years of study and initiation allowed them to take on responsibilities ranging from managing grain stores to overseeing ceremonies and advising city leaders. They were no longer merely children in training. They were authorities in their own right, capable of shaping the lives of ordinary people and commanding the respect of rulers. Their early isolation, rigorous education, and intimate knowledge of ritual and divination had prepared them for a life where fear, respect, and obedience were both tools and shields. And yet, despite their elevated status, the priests' lives remained demanding and precarious. Their power depended on perception, on the belief of the populace, and on the maintenance of social and spiritual order. Failure, whether in ritual, divination, or administration, could quickly erode influence. They had inherited privilege, yes, but it was a privilege steeped in responsibility, vigilance, and constant engagement with both mortal and divine forces. The very qualities that made them formidable, their knowledge, discipline, and authority, were also the chains that bound them to the temple for life. Through this rigorous, lifelong preparation, the Sumerian priesthood perpetuated a cycle of control. Children born into the robe became the next generation of intermediaries between humans and gods, arbiters of fortune and fear. Their inherited positions, cultivated skills, and early immersion in sacred knowledge ensured that the temple remained the pivot of power, capable of shaping entire cities, influencing kings, and instilling both reverence and terror in the hearts of ordinary citizens. The priesthood was a world apart, yet its reach extended into every home, field, and marketplace, a testament to the careful molding of the next generation from the earliest moments of life. The power of these priests was thus both inherited and meticulously crafted, a combination of tradition, education, and social engineering. To understand them is to understand how societies maintain control through institutions that shape the minds and behaviors of those within them from childhood. Born into the robe, trained in secrecy, schooled in ritual, divination, and politics, the Sumerian priest emerged not just as a figure of spiritual authority, but as a linchpin of an entire civilization, a person feared, respected, and in many ways unavoidable. The story of their lives offers insight into how knowledge, discipline, and heritage can be wielded as instruments of power, shaping not only individuals, but the very societies in which they live. From the moment one entered the temple precinct, it became clear that the priests were not merely men and women of learning. They were conduits, vessels of the divine, intermediaries between mortal concerns and the inscrutable will of the gods. The Sumerian people believed that every aspect of life, from the rise and fall of rivers to the prosperity of the harvest, was influenced by forces beyond comprehension, and that only the priests could interpret these forces with authority. Within the cool, echoing halls of the ziggurats, adorned with carved reliefs depicting deities and their triumphs, the priests conducted rituals that seemed almost theatrical in their precision. Yet each motion, each incantation, carried the weight of power that could alter the course of the city. Ordinary citizens watched from afar, their lives governed by instructions that emanated from these sacred interpreters. A nod, a chant, or even a facial expression from a priest could signal favor, wrath, or impending disaster. The divine connection claimed by the priests was not abstract. It was tangible and immediate. Farmers consulted them before sowing seeds, hoping for rain and protection from pests, while rulers and kings sought their guidance in matters of governance, war, and diplomacy. The priests would observe celestial patterns, interpret entrals, or read omens in water and fire, then deliver pronouncements that dictated public behavior. Their words were treated as if the gods themselves had spoken, shaping commerce, law, and everyday decisions. A missed festival or an incorrectly performed ritual could be labeled a transgression against the gods, punishable by fines, exile, or even death. The perception of divine favor was maintained through carefully orchestrated spectacle. Sacrificial ceremonies, grand processions, and carefully timed prayers were performed with meticulous attention to detail. The priests' ability to control these ceremonies reinforced their claim to divine insight. They dressed in elaborate robes, decorated with symbols representing the deities they served, and carried implements that were both practical for ritual and emblematic of their authority. Candles flickered in the dim light, smoke from burning incense filled the air, and every movement seemed imbued with sacred significance. The people, awed by the rituals and fearful of missteps, accepted the priests' declarations as truth. Yet the priests' connection to the gods was as much psychological as spiritual. They were trained from childhood to observe, interpret, and command attention. Their entire education reinforced the belief in unseen forces, and the community's reverence only deepened this conviction. By controlling access to divine knowledge, the priests effectively controlled the populace. Ordinary citizens could not approach the gods directly. Only the priests could mediate, ensuring that power flowed through the temple hierarchy. A harvest that failed could be blamed on a farmer's impiety, a ruler's misfortune on an elected ritual, and the priests would claim authority to remedy the situation through offerings, prayers, and decrees. This power over perception allowed priests to influence events far beyond the temple walls. Kings would consult them before declaring war, planning infrastructure, or distributing resources. Merchants would seek approval to trade certain goods, ensuring prosperity or avoiding disaster based on divine interpretation. Families would offer tributes, hoping to avert illness or misfortune, all under the guidance of those who claimed a direct line to the gods. In this way, the priests were both advisors and enforcers, their influence legitimized by the fear and awe inspired in those who depended on their judgment. The ritual practices themselves were complex and varied. Some priests specialized in divination through animal entrails, a practice requiring careful dissection and interpretation of every organ and texture. Others observed stars and celestial movements, calculating auspicious days for planting or ceremonies. Still others examined dreams, interpreting subtle signs or symbols as messages from the divine. Each method was rigorous, demanding not only knowledge, but intuition and authority. When a priest pronounced an omen or declared divine will, it was expected to be obeyed without question. Even kings, despite their temporal power, deferred to the spiritual authority of the temple, recognizing that challenging the priest could invite calamity. The interplay between fear and faith was carefully cultivated. Priests did not merely perform rituals. They demonstrated their connection to the gods in ways that left witnesses in awe. Thunderstorms might be attributed to divine displeasure, drought to neglected offerings, and sudden plagues to human error. The priest's interpretations provided an explanation for chaos in an unpredictable world, offering both guidance and justification for control. People learned to comply, to honor the rituals, and to respect the priest's judgment because the consequences of ignoring divine signs were believed to be immediate and severe. Power within the temple was not evenly distributed. Some priests held positions of tremendous influence, managing grain stores, enforcing law, or directing ceremonies attended by the elite. Others served as assistants, learning the subtleties of interpretation, observation, and ritual performance. Yet all shared the common attribute of being intermediaries, claiming the authority to speak with, hear from, and act on behalf of the gods. Through this hierarchical system, the temple maintained not only religious authority, but social control, reinforcing its centrality in every aspect of Sumerian life. The fear inspired by priests was also a form of social cohesion. When the populace believed that misfortune could strike at any moment due to divine disfavor, obedience became not only prudent, but necessary. Rituals became markers of collective identity and compliance, and the priests were the arbiters of these rules. Instructing citizens in what to do, when to act, and how to behave ensured that daily life followed a predictable pattern, and deviation could be swiftly addressed with a claim of divine displeasure. This constant oversight created a subtle but pervasive form of governance, one that relied as much on belief and fear as on tangible enforcement. At the same time, the priesthood's claimed connection to the divine also protected them from challenges. Ordinary citizens could rarely question the wisdom or authority of those who spoke for the gods. Kings could argue, advisors could debate, but the pronouncements of a priest were difficult to dispute without inviting suspicion or, worse, the accusation of impiety. This monopoly on sacred knowledge allowed the priests to act as a stabilizing force, but also as manipulators of the populace, shaping behavior, consolidating wealth, and maintaining social hierarchies. Even internal conflicts within the temple hierarchy reflected the power of the divine connection. Rivalries were fought not only for access to material resources, but also for perceived closeness to the gods. A priest who could demonstrate more insight, perform more spectacular rituals, or deliver more compelling divinations gained influence over both rulers and commoners. This competition was often subtle, expressed in the order of participation in ceremonies, the size and prominence of offerings, or the interpretation of omens that affected political and economic decisions. In this way, the divine connection was both a tool and a prize, central to maintaining and expanding authority. The psychological impact on citizens cannot be overstated. The priests' proclamations shaped the collective imagination. They offered explanations for the unexplainable, comfort in the face of uncertainty, and fear to enforce order. Their words could calm anxieties or provoke panic, encourage productivity, or instill obedience. Even those who doubted the divine could not escape the social consequences of ignoring a priest's declaration, making the belief in their connection self-reinforcing. Communities became deeply invested in the priesthood's authority, a relationship built on necessity, fear, and the desire for favor from the unseen. Through all these mechanisms, the Sumerian priests maintained a near-absolute control over both spiritual and temporal life. Their claimed access to the divine allowed them to arbitrate disputes, predict calamities, and enforce compliance with both religious and civic law. They occupied a space where belief and authority merged, where fear and reverence reinforced each other, and where the consequences of error or disobedience were immediate and often severe. From the young initiate learning sacred rites to the high priest commanding king's attention, The perception of divine connection was the linchpin of power, shaping the society in ways that extended far beyond the temple walls. Ultimately, the priest's power rested on a simple yet profound premise. The people could not see the gods, but they could see the priests. They could not speak directly to the divine, but they could hear its will through the priest's voice. Every decision, every crop, every law, and every punishment carried the shadow of divine authority, ensuring that the priesthood remained feared, respected, and for many, unavoidable. In claiming a direct line to the gods, the Sumerian priests established themselves as both protectors and enforcers, figures whose influence shaped the physical, spiritual, and political landscapes of one of the earliest civilizations in human history. In Sumerian society, the power of the priesthood was not merely derived from the claim to speak with the gods, but also from the secrets they held arcane knowledge that could heal, harm, or manipulate with devastating precision. From the moment a child entered the temple as a novice, they were taught that certain knowledge was too potent to be shared lightly. Medicine, divination, ritual practice, and even the careful handling of poisons were disciplines guarded jealously within the sacred walls. What a layperson saw as a simple chant, a set of symbols, or the mixing of herbs was in truth a codified system of control, a web of influence that placed priests above kings, merchants, and commoners alike. Knowledge in this world equated to life or death, favor or ruin, and those who wielded it did so with deliberate calculation. The temple functioned like a school, a fortress, and a vault all at once. Young initiates learned the language of cuneiform to record sacred texts, memorize incantations, and understand rituals so complex that errors could be catastrophic. Medicine was taught alongside divination, each blending science and superstition in ways that made the practitioner indispensable. Herbs, roots, and mineral compounds were not mere remedies. They were tools of power. A correctly prepared ointment could cure fevers that threatened entire communities, while a misapplied mixture or a deliberately poisoned one could end a life swiftly and silently. The threat of such knowledge kept kings in check, secured obedience from the populace, and silenced rivals before they could gain a foothold. Secrets extended beyond the material. Priests maintained detailed records of omens, celestial movements, and historical events, linking past calamities to present behavior. This allowed them to craft narratives that reinforced their authority. A poor harvest could be explained by human error, a flood blamed on improper ritual observance. By controlling the story, priests controlled perception. Their words were interpreted as divine judgment, giving them the leverage to punish, reward, or manipulate with near absolute certainty. Even rulers deferred, because questioning a priest's interpretation could be construed as impiety, a direct affront to the gods themselves. The threat of knowledge was further magnified by the secrecy surrounding sacred rituals. Many ceremonies were closed to the public, performed behind veiled spaces where only priests and select nobles could witness the proceedings. The intricate steps of sacrifice, the precise placement of offerings, and the exact pronunciation of prayers were all guarded, memorized to prevent error or misuse. To an outsider, the ceremony appeared mystical, almost magical, reinforcing the idea that the priests possessed abilities that transcended ordinary understanding. It was this combination of mystery and danger that cemented fear. To challenge a priest was not only audacious, but potentially fatal. Some of the most potent secrets involved poisons and protective rituals. Texts contained detailed instructions for concocting substances that could quietly eliminate a political rival or subtly manipulate events in the city. Only the most trusted and advanced priests were permitted access to these formulas, often under oath or spiritual penalty. Knowledge of these dangers created a culture of caution. Among elites, nobles consulted priests not only for guidance but for protection, aware that the slightest misstep could expose them to hidden threats. Similarly, commoners learned quickly that angering a priest could have consequences beyond immediate punishment. Rumors of unexplained deaths, curses, or sudden illness were often traced, correctly or not, to the secretive authority of the temple. Medicine, too, was a double-edged sword. Priests who mastered treatments could save entire households from plague, malnutrition, or infection. But the same remedies could be withheld, delayed, or misapplied, leaving patients vulnerable and reinforcing the perception that life itself rested in the hands of the knowledgeable. This dynamic created an unspoken hierarchy. Those who sought favor gained access to life-saving interventions, while those who defied the priest risked illness or death. It was a subtle form of control, predicated on the intimate association between knowledge and survival. Even rituals considered mundane were steeped in secret significance. Offerings, chants, and ceremonial gestures were often imbued with layers of meaning known only to the initiated. Mistakes could be interpreted as signs of disrespect, misfortune, or even treachery. In this way, knowledge became both a shield and a weapon. Priests could assert dominance over lay people and rulers alike, not through force alone, but by demonstrating that they possessed understanding that others could not access. Fear of the unknown, magnified by carefully cultivated awe, ensured compliance and reinforced the social hierarchy. The management of information was also a political tool. Priests kept detailed records of disputes, oaths, and agreements, knowing that revelation or concealment of these details could alter the balance of power in the city. A whispered suggestion, a cleverly timed revelation, or a strategic omission could topple a rival, secure loyalty, or manipulate commerce. Secrets were not static. They were living instruments of influence, carefully deployed to maintain the authority and prestige of the temple. Kings, merchants, and ordinary citizens quickly realized that the priesthood as knowledge was as much a weapon as a gift. Initiates were trained to respect the sanctity of this information. Breaking the rules of disclosure was not merely a social violation. It was considered a spiritual crime, punishable by exile, physical reprimand, or, in extreme cases, execution. The weight of this responsibility instilled discipline, obedience, and reverence among those entering the priesthood, ensuring that knowledge remained concentrated in a controlled and loyal cohort. The consequences of sharing forbidden information, whether intentional or accidental, were communicated through ritualized instruction, warnings, and historical examples, reinforcing the perception of danger and the necessity of secrecy. Even within the priesthood, knowledge created hierarchies. Senior priests enjoyed privileges, influence, and access denied to novices. The ability to interpret omens, administer complex rituals, or wield the more dangerous remedies and potions elevated certain individuals above their peers. This internal stratification mirrored the wider social control the priests exerted over the city. Those who knew more could command more, and even a king might hesitate to challenge a priest who demonstrated superior insight. The careful cultivation of mystery, paired with actual knowledge, amplified the priesthood's authority, making them nearly untouchable in the eyes of society. The perception of omniscience, created through secrecy, also reinforced obedience. Ordinary citizens might never witness a ritual, see the preparation of medicines, or understand the calculation behind divinations. Yet they observed outcomes harvests that failed or succeeded, illnesses cured or not, omens that seemed fulfilled, and concluded that the priests possessed knowledge that mortals could not comprehend. The fear that one might unknowingly offend the gods, and thus the priests, became a powerful social regulator. Compliance was ensured less through coercion than through the pervasive belief that the priests knew more than anyone else, and could act upon that knowledge in ways beyond comprehension. Secrets, therefore, were simultaneously protective and coercive. Priests protected sacred knowledge from misuse, preserving the efficacy of rituals and remedies, while coercing obedience through the perceived omnipotence of their insight. This dual role elevated the priesthood above ordinary societal structures, allowing them to influence every facet of life: agriculture, law, commerce, health, and politics. Their authority was not granted by force alone, but by the careful management of what was known and what was concealed, and the consequences of revealing or violating that knowledge were never abstract. They were real, immediate, and often terrifying. In this environment, even kings and rulers approached the temple with caution. While a king could command armies or levy taxes, he could not command the favor of the gods. Priests, holding secret knowledge and claiming divine insight, could predict disasters, interpret omens, and even manipulate political alliances in ways that ensured the ruler's dependence. Challenging a priest without justification risked social, political, and spiritual backlash. The subtle yet absolute power of knowledge allowed the temple to operate as an authority parallel to the monarchy, ensuring its relevance, reverence, and fear. Ultimately, the secrets held by Sumerian priests were more than tools. They were lifelines and weapons, capable of shaping society, controlling behavior, and enforcing hierarchy. By controlling what was seen, heard, and understood, the priests created a system in which power flowed through knowledge, and knowledge flowed only through them. In a world governed by divine will, human obedience, and the delicate balance of survival, secrecy was the ultimate currency. Those who possessed it were feared, respected, and cursed, for to know the hidden truths of life, death, and the gods was to wield a power that few could challenge and none could ignore. The temple's secrets ensured that the priesthood remained central, commanding, and eternal in the consciousness of the Sumerian civilization. In the cities and villages of ancient Sumer, fear was as much a tangible force as wind or sun, and the priesthood wielded it with precision. For ordinary citizens, the temple was not merely a place of worship, but a seat of power whose influence reached into every corner of life. The priests understood that their authority was fragile, if only rooted in ritual. They needed a mechanism to ensure compliance, devotion, and above all, obedience. Fear became this instrument, a subtle, pervasive, and devastatingly effective tool. Whispered tales of curses and divine wrath spread among the populace, reinforced by carefully constructed narratives of disaster, illness, and misfortune. It was not unusual for villagers to cross themselves, mutter prayers, or bend to the priest's will, simply because the memory of a past calamity, attributed to divine punishment, haunted them. The priest's ability to claim credit for both averting and predicting disasters allowed them to maintain a precarious grip on power, making fear both the mechanism and the justification for their influence. The manipulation of fear began with perception. Priests did not simply perform rituals. They orchestrated them in ways that magnified their authority. Sacred spaces were designed to awe as well as intimidate. High ceilings, imposing columns, and intricately carved reliefs depicted gods in grand, sometimes terrifying forms. The chants, recitations, and rhythms of the rituals reinforced a sense of otherworldliness. As villagers and nobles alike watched these ceremonies, the line between mortal and divine seemed impossibly thin, and the priest's presence became a conduit for the gods' judgment. Even a simple glance from a priest could be interpreted as a mark of favor or the first whisper of an imminent curse. In a world where life and death were believed to be tightly linked to divine will, the psychological weight of such interpretations was enormous. No one wanted to risk offending a man who might speak for the gods themselves. Stories circulated of those who had angered the gods through hubris, laziness, or impiety, their fates often exaggerated to instill vigilance. A merchant who ignored a ritual might fall ill the following week. A farmer who questioned a temple decree could suffer crop failure. Whether or not these misfortunes were truly linked to divine intervention, the association was sufficient to cement a climate of fear. Priests reinforced these connections through narrative, attributing illness, famine, or accidents to human failings observed or judged by the temple. The power of suggestion and the careful cultivation of reputation created a self-reinforcing system. Fear of punishment ensured adherence, while adherence validated the priesthood's omnipotence. Accusations of angering the gods carried weight that extended far beyond personal guilt. To be branded as impious or disrespectful could endanger one's family, business, or social standing. The priesthood, through subtle insinuation or outright proclamation, could mobilize communal pressure against the accused. Villagers might avoid their company, withdraw trade, or even participate in ritualized censure. The individual, already terrorized by the notion of divine wrath, found themselves cornered by both spiritual and social consequences. Fear, in this sense, was a multi-layered mechanism of control. It combined the threat of supernatural punishment with tangible social repercussions, making it nearly inescapable. Even the elite were not immune. Kings, governors, and wealthy merchants understood the delicate balance of power. While they commanded armies and wealth, they relied on priests to interpret omens and divine guidance. A warning of impending disaster, if ignored, could lead to unrest, famine, or disease, all of which would destabilize a ruler's authority. Conversely, alignment with the priests could reinforce legitimacy, justify harsh measures, or secure support from the populace. In this way, fear became a political instrument, extending beyond the individual to influence governance, economic stability, and public order. The priesthood's ability to frame events as the outcome of divine anger allowed them to position themselves as indispensable intermediaries between gods and mortals. Public displays amplified this effect. Ceremonies of atonement, processions, or punishments for those deemed impure served as vivid reminders of the consequences of failing to respect divine authority. A man who violated a taboo might be paraded before the community or subjected to ritual humiliation. Even if these actions were symbolic, the psychological impact was profound. Observers internalized the lesson. Failure to heed the priest's guidance could lead to personal disaster, while obedience ensured protection and favor. Fear was thus communal, shared, and reinforced by both action and inaction, embedding the priest's authority deep within the cultural consciousness. The priest's mastery of human psychology was subtle yet pervasive. By controlling the narrative around misfortune, they created ambiguity in which the guilty and the innocent could not reliably distinguish the source of disaster. Disease, famine, accidents, and unexplained deaths were all interpreted as manifestations of divine displeasure. The randomness of such events enhanced the perception of priestly power. When misfortune struck, the common explanation pointed to human error, observed by those who understood the god's will. This perception cultivated constant vigilance, as villagers sought to avoid offense through ritual, compliance, and deference. Fear became habitual, almost reflexive, guiding behavior without overt coercion. Even whispers within the community reinforced the mechanism of fear. Rumors about curses, omens, or divine punishment circulated quickly, often unverified but potent in their effect. A child might be admonished by a parent for wandering near a forbidden temple area. A worker might hesitate to question a priest for fear of attracting misfortune. The narrative power of fear extended through socialization, education, and folklore, creating a cultural environment in which the priesthood's authority was seldom challenged. In this sense, fear was not merely a tool wielded by the priests. It was embedded into the very fabric of society, shaping beliefs, routines, and decisions at every level. Fear also allowed priests to manipulate resources. Grain, water, and medicinal herbs could be framed as sacred or controlled by divine sanction, restricting access and reinforcing dependence. By implying that the misuse of resources could provoke the god's anger, priests made the population compliant, ensuring both reverence and obedience. Even mundane acts, like attending market or performing daily chores, were suffused with the awareness of divine oversight. The omnipresent possibility of divine punishment shaped thought and action alike, creating a society in which fear served as an invisible yet potent chain. The individual experience of fear was intimate and constant. A glance from a priest, a subtle gesture, or a whispered warning could haunt a person for days, influencing decisions and interactions. Entire households structured their lives around the anticipation of displeasing the divine, and by extension, the priests. Children learned early to respect ritual, speak carefully, and avoid gestures that could be misinterpreted. Adults internalized the need for vigilance, recognizing that the consequences of angering the gods were both immediate and enduring. The internalization of fear ensured the sustainability of the priesthood as authority without resorting to overt violence in every instance. In times of crisis, whether famine, flood, or epidemic, the role of fear was heightened. Priests became interpreters of disaster, arbiters of blame, and guides for remediation. Their pronouncements carried immense weight. They could attribute suffering to human failings, prescribe costly rituals, or demand public atonement. The fear of failing to comply, combined with the pressing urgency of survival, ensured that their guidance was followed without question. In these moments, fear was not abstract. It was immediate, actionable, and often life-determining. Even the threats that were never realized reinforced obedience. Stories of curses, divine vengeance, or mysterious deaths were told and retold, shaping collective memory and reinforcing cultural norms. Whether based in fact, exaggeration, or fabrication, these accounts created a web of anticipation and caution. Citizens navigated life with the understanding that divine displeasure could strike unpredictably, and priests were the only intermediaries who could manage it. In this way, fear was both prophylactic and prescriptive, shaping behavior long before any actual punishment occurred. Ultimately, the Sumerian priesthood's use of fear was an art form, combining psychological insight, social influence, and ritualized authority. It was a subtle but powerful means of maintaining control, ensuring that both elite and commoner alike deferred to their knowledge, obeyed their instructions, and internalized their power. The glance that seemed casual, the words spoken in hushed tones, the careful orchestration of ritual all contributed to a society in which the consequences of disobedience felt tangible and unavoidable. Fear, in this context, was not cruelty for its own sake, but an instrument of governance, shaping thoughts, actions, and beliefs in ways that ensured the priesthood remained central, dominant, and feared. In this world, obedience was survival. The fear cultivated by the priests was more than superstition. It was a mechanism that structured society, reinforced hierarchy, and maintained the delicate balance between mortal ambition and divine will. Villagers, nobles, and kings all recognized that the power of the temple rested not only in ritual or knowledge, but in the intimate, pervasive, and enduring grip of fear. It ensured that the Sumerian priesthood was never merely a class of religious functionaries. They were arbiters of life, death, and destiny, their influence absolute, their control near unassailable, and their presence a constant, haunting reminder of the price of defiance. In the heart of Sumerian cities, the temple loomed not only as a spiritual center, but as an economic powerhouse, a place where wealth, influence, and divine authority intersected. Within these walls, priests exercised control over grain stores, trade, and ritual offerings, positioning themselves at the intersection of need and desire. It was a world in which the line between sacred duty and personal gain often blurred, and the mechanisms of power were tightly intertwined with the acquisition of wealth. Bribery and corruption were not occasional lapses, but an embedded aspect of the system, woven into the daily interactions between priest and citizen, ruler and intermediary, commoner and elite. Those who could offer silver, gifts, or loyalty gained favor, protection, or preferential treatment. Those who could not or who refused found themselves at the mercy of punitive measures, ranging from social humiliation to overt physical punishment. In this way, wealth and compliance became inseparable, and the priesthood's dominance was reinforced through a combination of fear, obligation, and material dependence. The system of bribery began subtly, almost imperceptibly, yet its effects were far-reaching. A farmer bringing a portion of his harvest to the temple might be given explicit guidance on the correct rituals to perform to ensure divine favor, but often an additional gift, an extra measure of grain, or a small amount of silver, would secure the priest as attention and blessing. Those who failed to provide such offerings risked not only spiritual neglect, but social consequences. Their crops could fail, their debts might increase, or they could be publicly shamed during festivals or temple gatherings. The intertwining of piety and payment created a landscape in which the priesthood's influence was both spiritual and material, ensuring that control extended into every aspect of daily life. Citizens learned that the price of survival was often measured not only in obedience, but in currency or goods, creating a delicate balance of fear, respect, and necessity. This culture of corruption was not confined to interactions with the lower classes. Even rulers and governors, despite their wealth and armies, found themselves compelled to navigate the demands of the priesthood carefully. Gifts, tributes, or elaborate offerings could sway priestly counsel, influencing decisions on trade, warfare, or taxation. The priests' role as intermediaries with the gods gave them leverage in matters of state, and their acceptance of bribes created a quiet but pervasive manipulation of power. A king might consult the high priest for an omen before battle, unaware that the interpretation he received could be subtly influenced by the gifts he had or had not provided. In such circumstances, bribery became not merely a personal transaction, but a political instrument, shaping the fates of cities, armies, and empires. It ensured that priests remained indispensable, their authority extending far beyond spiritual matters into the corridors of governance, where wealth and influence intersected with the divine. The mechanisms of corruption were often reinforced through public rituals and ceremonies. When offerings were made, they were not hidden exchanges, but performed with careful attention to visibility. Silver coins, fine fabrics, and other valuables were presented before assembled citizens, reinforcing the priest's status and reminding the community that access to favor, divine or earthly, was mediated by wealth. Such displays served multiple purposes. They solidified the priest's authority, normalized the expectation of payment, and created social pressure to comply. Citizens internalized the belief that those who were generous in their offerings would prosper, while those who withheld gifts would invite misfortune. The act of bribery, though technically optional, became a cultural norm, embedded in ritual and reinforced by fear and observation. In this way, corruption was not merely a private vice. It became a public, systemic, and self-perpetuating tool of control. For those unable to pay, the consequences could be swift and humiliating. A poor family might arrive at the temple with what little grain they could spare, only to be told their offering was insufficient. The priest's judgment, framed as divine will, could lead to public admonishment, a curse, or assignment to menial or degrading duties. The very act of refusal or inability to contribute transformed into a moral failing in the eyes of the community, reinforcing social hierarchies and consolidating the priest's power. Fear of such repercussions ensured compliance even among those most resistant, and over time, resentment simmered quietly alongside obedience. People whispered in markets and taverns about priests who enriched themselves at the expense of the weak, but the fear of divine retribution and social isolation made open defiance nearly impossible. Bribery thus became both a symbol and a mechanism of inequality, sustaining the priesthood's dominance while fostering an undercurrent of discontent. The priest's exploitation of the system extended into the management of grain and resources. During harvest, the temple controlled vast stores of food, distributing it selectively based on contributions, loyalty, or perceived piety. A merchant or landowner who wished to secure access to grain during lean months might be compelled to offer significant gifts or payments to the priests. Even ordinary villagers, reliant on temple-controlled granaries, were subject to similar pressures. By controlling access to sustenance, priests created a tangible dependency that reinforced both fear and obligation. The perception of divine oversight made resistance dangerous. To challenge the priest as authority was not simply an affront to a mortal official, but an act of defiance against the gods themselves. The intertwining of economic control and spiritual authority ensured that bribery was not merely opportunistic, but systemic, a structural feature of society. Corruption also extended into judicial and ritual matters. Priests often served as judges, arbiters, or mediators in disputes, and their decisions could be influenced by gifts or favors. A wealthy merchant might secure a favorable ruling by presenting valuable items or donations to the temple, while a poor petitioner could find judgment rendered against them regardless of merit. Rituals, too, could be manipulated. Omens, sacrifices, or purification ceremonies could be expedited, enhanced, or interpreted favorably for those who offered compensation. The blending of justice, ritual, and bribery created a pervasive culture in which power, wealth, and divine sanction were inseparable, and where compliance could be purchased while resistance carried significant risk. In this system, morality and legality were flexible, shaped by the priesthood's discretion and the availability of offerings. The psychological impact of bribery and corruption was profound. Citizens internalized a hierarchy in which influence and survival were intertwined with material wealth and the priesthood as favor. Anxiety, stress, and apprehension were constant companions. A poor harvest, an illness, or a personal misfortune could be attributed to insufficient contributions, real or imagined. Families and communities adapted their behavior to avoid attracting negative attention, often prioritizing offerings to the temple above other needs. In this way, corruption extended beyond material gain into the shaping of thought, behavior, and social relations. It became both a tool of control and a lens through which people interpreted their world, reinforcing the priesthood's central role in daily life. Over time, resentment toward corrupt priests simmered alongside fear. Stories circulated of wealthy clerics enriching themselves at the expense of the needy, of favors purchased with silver, and of justice skewed in favor of those with resources. Yet open rebellion was rare, as the intertwining of spiritual authority and social pressure made defiance perilous. People complied because the cost of resistance, both divine and social, was unacceptably high. Bribery and corruption thus functioned not only as mechanisms for personal enrichment, but as instruments of social stability, ensuring that the priesthood remained indispensable, feared, and respected. The combination of fear, dependency, and visible wealth created a cycle in which bribery reinforced power, power demanded tribute, and tribute reinforced fear. Every interaction, from the smallest gift of grain to the most lavish donation of silver or textiles, perpetuated a system in which priests were both rulers and arbiters of destiny. By manipulating access to resources, controlling interpretation of events, and enforcing ritual obligations, the priesthood embedded themselves in the very structure of society. Compliance was rewarded, resistance punished, and the perception of divine sanction provided an unassailable justification for exploitation. Ultimately, bribery and corruption in Sumerian temples were not incidental. They were fundamental to the exercise of power. By intertwining material wealth, spiritual authority, and social control, the priests ensured their influence permeated every level of life. Villagers, merchants, rulers, and kings alike learned to navigate this system, balancing fear, loyalty, and contribution to maintain favor and avoid punishment. The priesthood's dominion was both psychological and material, sustained by the careful orchestration of perception, ritual, and economic leverage. Those who failed to recognize or adapt to this reality often suffered, reinforcing the perception that wealth, devotion, and compliance were inseparable pathways to survival. In this world, fear and bribery were two sides of the same coin, ensuring that the priesthood remained unchallenged, unassailable, and deeply resented yet endlessly obeyed. They ruled not merely through rituals or divine claims, but through a sophisticated, pervasive system of dependency, obligation, and intimidation. Those who lived under their influence understood that survival required both deference and payment, and that the priesthood's reach extended into every aspect of existence, shaping not only what people did, but how they thought, felt, and hoped for mercy. The Sumerian priests' exploitation of bribery and corruption exemplified the enduring power of wealth and fear, cementing their place at the center of both earthly and divine order and ensuring their authority remained absolute, pervasive, and deeply human in its calculated cunning. Behind the massive walls of the Sumerian temples, hidden from the eyes of ordinary citizens and even many of the temple's lower-ranking attendants, dark rituals took place that few dared to question or observe. These were ceremonies steeped in secrecy, carried out in the shadowed inner sanctums of the temple, where only the highest-ranking priests were permitted. The flickering light of oil lamps danced along stone walls, casting long dancing shadows that seemed to animate the carvings of gods and monsters etched into the walls over generations. Every movement, every whisper, and every gesture was carefully choreographed according to traditions that had been passed down in secrecy for centuries. For those outside the inner sanctum, all they could do was speculate, their imaginations filling in the terrifying blanks with stories of blood, power, and divine wrath. The unknown became more fearsome than any truth, and the veil of secrecy surrounding these rituals added to the priesthood's aura of absolute authority. The rituals themselves were often intense and grueling. Fasting for days, strict bodily purification, and long periods of meditation or vigil were common, even for priests of high rank. These acts were presented as necessary to communicate with the gods, to ensure that divine will could be interpreted correctly, and that the city would prosper. Yet the austerity of these ceremonies also served to isolate the practitioners from the common people, elevating their status and separating them from ordinary life. The physical strain of the rituals hardened the priests' bodies and minds, reinforcing the perception that they were touched by the divine, capable of enduring suffering that mere mortals could not. The rigorous adherence to these rites demonstrated discipline, obedience, and fearlessness, all qualities that inspired awe, suspicion, and sometimes dread among observers and participants alike. In addition to fasting and meditation, other rites were far more obscure and terrifying in their perceived intent. Sacrifices, both symbolic and actual, were sometimes performed, their purpose to appease deities or avert misfortune from the city. Livestock could be offered in elaborate ceremonies, their blood poured onto sacred altars while chants echoed through the temple halls. The sight of these offerings, combined with the scent of smoke and the ceremonial sounds, left a deep impression on those who witnessed even fragments of the ritual. Stories spread quickly, distorted by fear and gossip, of secret sacrifices of humans or children, though the truth was often obscured by layers of rumor and exaggeration. These tales, regardless of their accuracy, contributed to a climate in which priests were seen as wielders of life and death, capable of intervening in the mortal world through unseen forces. The aura of mystery and terror was integral to maintaining control over the populace, ensuring that obedience was not simply motivated by fear of punishment, but by awe of what might be unleashed if rules were broken. The secrecy surrounding these rituals extended to the very design of the temple itself. Inner sanctums were deliberately concealed, access controlled by multiple levels of priests, each with their own specialized knowledge of rites, incantations, and ceremonial procedures. Lower-ranking attendants might catch glimpses of figures moving behind heavy curtains, or hear the rhythmic cadence of chants reverberating through stone corridors. But the full scope of the ceremonies remained hidden. The architecture reinforced the hierarchy. The further one progressed toward the innermost chambers. The greater the sense of danger and reverence, the more intimidating the space. Each threshold, each doorway, marked a transition from the mundane world to the sacred and the potentially terrifying. Even those accustomed to temple life were not immune to awe and fear in these areas, as the knowledge of forbidden rituals and hidden powers created a palpable tension, a constant reminder of the priest's extraordinary position in society. The psychological impact of these hidden ceremonies was profound, not only for the priests who performed them, but for the wider community as well. Citizens, unable to witness these rites directly, filled the gaps with speculation. Whispers in markets, taverns, and homes spoke of priests who could call down plagues or blessings, curse rivals, or reveal the secrets of the gods. Fear and curiosity were intertwined. People knew that transgression could invite divine wrath, and yet they were drawn to the stories of what occurred behind closed doors. The priests skillfully cultivated this atmosphere, never fully revealing the extent of their actions, letting uncertainty and rumor amplify their power. Even those who followed the rituals faithfully often murmured questions under their breath, unsure whether what they saw was real or part of a calculated display to inspire reverence and terror. The unknown became a tool, a psychological lever that reinforced the authority and mystique of the priesthood. The rites themselves could involve the use of symbolic implements, sacred texts, and carefully orchestrated motions designed to demonstrate mastery over unseen forces. Each element held meaning. The placement of a bowl, the sequence of steps, the intonation of specific phrases, all were believed to channel divine energy and influence the course of events in the city. The complexity of these ceremonies made them virtually incomprehensible to ordinary people, reinforcing the perception that the priests possessed secret knowledge that was both dangerous and essential. Participation in or observation of these rituals required obedience and precision. Mistakes were not only spiritually dangerous, but could lead to severe consequences for those responsible. In this way, secrecy, ritual, and the threat of punishment intertwined to create a system in which power was concentrated, maintained, and unchallenged. At times, these ceremonies intersected with other aspects of temple life, such as divination, healing, or legal judgment. Priests who performed sacrifices or fasting rituals might also interpret omens in the movement of stars, the flow of rivers, or the outcome of a minor illness. Their interpretations carried weight because of the aura established through secrecy and perceived divine favor. Even if a judgment or prediction seemed arbitrary, the psychological authority invested in the priesthood meant that citizens rarely questioned it. The secrecy surrounding the rituals ensured that no one outside the inner sanctums could fully evaluate the priest's actions, creating an environment in which faith, fear, and obedience were inseparable. Compliance was rewarded with protection or blessing, while skepticism was met with suspicion, censure, or rumor-driven fear. Rumors of hidden rituals, whispered in crowded marketplaces or quiet village squares, often took on lives of their own. Stories of priests performing sacrifices at night, communing with spirits, or invoking curses became part of the social fabric, a constant undercurrent of tension and awe. Even those who had never entered a temple knew, through second or third-hand accounts, that dark powers were wielded in hidden spaces. The stories varied in detail, some describing elaborate ceremonies, others suggesting dire consequences for those who failed to participate or show respect. The result was a culture in which fear and reverence were entwined, ensuring that priests maintained influence even among those they never encountered directly. Knowledge and secrecy became weapons, as powerful as any sword, capable of shaping behavior, thought, and social hierarchy. The exclusivity of the inner sanctum created a sense of elite camaraderie among the high priests. Sharing in these rituals was not merely a matter of spiritual duty. It was a demonstration of trust, loyalty, and superior knowledge. Lower-ranking priests or attendants might perform menial tasks outside the chambers, observing protocols and following instructions without ever fully understanding their purpose. This division reinforced a rigid hierarchy, one that ensured obedience and minimized challenges to authority. Even among the initiated, knowledge was carefully parceled, with each individual mastering only the parts necessary to perform their assigned roles. The fragmentation of understanding prevented any single person from acquiring the full scope of power, keeping control centralized in the hands of the senior priesthood. The secrecy and fear surrounding these ceremonies also served practical purposes. By controlling access to knowledge and the perception of divine influence, priests could manipulate social, economic, and political outcomes. Threats of divine punishment, interpreted through these rituals, could be leveraged to ensure compliance from rulers, merchants, and commoners alike. The rituals themselves, complex and dramatic, demonstrated the priest's mastery of forces beyond ordinary understanding, reinforcing the notion that the temple was not merely a religious institution, but a seat of unassailable authority. By maintaining the veil of secrecy, the priesthood ensured that their power remained unquestioned, their influence pervasive, and their control absolute. Even loyal followers were not immune to unease. The very fact that rituals occurred beyond sight, beyond understanding, created a mixture of awe, respect, and fear. People speculated on what might happen to those who failed in their duties, the potential for divine retribution, or the hidden consequences of seemingly minor transgressions. This uncertainty served to bind the population more tightly to the temple, as compliance was the safest path and curiosity carried risk. The psychological grip of secrecy, reinforced by spectacle and rumor, ensured that the priest's authority extended far beyond the physical boundaries of the temple, shaping the beliefs, behaviors, and fears of the entire city. Over time, these hidden ceremonies became woven into the social fabric, a backdrop against which every act of daily life was interpreted. Harvests, illnesses, floods, and successes were all understood within the framework established by the priests. The knowledge that unseen rituals were continuously performed lent weight to every blessing, curse, or judgment. Ordinary citizens, aware that powerful rites were taking place in secret, internalized a constant awareness of divine oversight mediated by human hands. This integration of secrecy, ritual, and perceived supernatural power created a feedback loop. Priests maintained control through fear, awe, and mystery, and the populace reinforced this authority through belief, deference, and material offerings. In conclusion, the dark rituals performed behind closed doors in Sumerian temples were more than spiritual exercises. They were instruments of control, psychological leverage, and social hierarchy. Their secrecy amplified the priest's power, instilled awe and fear, and ensured obedience across classes. Every hidden chant, sacrifice, or gesture reinforced the perception that the priests held knowledge and influence beyond mortal comprehension. For those living under their sway, the rituals were both terrifying and compelling, a constant reminder of the thin line between divine favor and wrath, between prosperity and misfortune, and between life and death. By shrouding their ceremonies in secrecy, Sumerian priests cultivated an atmosphere in which power was absolute, fear was constant, and obedience was the only path to survival. In the sprawling cities and villages of Sumer, the ordinary people lived under the constant shadow of the priesthood, whose authority seemed absolute, and whose power could be felt in every aspect of daily life. Outside the high walls of the temples, beyond the flickering oil lamps and the ritual chambers, commoners faced a world in which misfortune was never random and accidents were never meaningless. Every crop that withered prematurely, every sudden illness, every storm or flood could be interpreted as a reflection of human error, divine displeasure, or the unspoken wrath of a priest. Those who belonged to the temple hierarchy were shielded from this scrutiny. Their lives were guided by knowledge, ritual, and access to the sacred inner chambers. Those on the outside, however, existed in a state of perpetual vulnerability. To live outside the robes and secrets of the priesthood was to walk a narrow path where every misstep could bring suspicion, blame, or even punishment. The curse of exclusion, as it came to be perceived among ordinary Sumerians, was subtle and pervasive. When famine struck a village, it was never just an unfortunate consequence of drought or poor harvests. It was a failure of ritual, a lapse in obedience, or a test administered by the gods, mediated through the priest's authority. Villagers whispered anxiously about the consequences of missing a required offering, or of speaking disrespectfully of the temple, even in private. Children were raised with these stories, told at night in the dim glow of hearth fires, learning early that their survival depended on appeasing forces far beyond their control. Illness was similarly attributed to spiritual imbalance or priestly displeasure. A fever might not be a natural affliction, but a punishment for failing to honor the gods, a reflection of hidden misdeeds, or a subtle sign that the temple's favor had shifted elsewhere. In a society where mortality was high and misfortune common, such explanations were not only plausible but necessary, giving structure and meaning to an unpredictable world. The priests themselves maintained this perception with careful precision. Their actions, often opaque and ritualized, were open to interpretation but never fully explained. A priest's gaze could seem casual or passing, yet for villagers, it carried weight. Did he notice a transgression? Was a curse implicit in the glance? The uncertainty alone was enough to provoke anxiety and obedience. By cultivating an aura of inscrutable power, priests ensured that even those who had no direct interaction with the temple were constantly aware of its influence. Every misfortune, every unexplained illness, every lost opportunity became a cautionary tale, reinforcing the idea that exclusion from priestly knowledge was not only a social disadvantage, but a spiritual hazard. Those outside the sacred order were constantly reminded that the favor of the temple, and, by extension, the gods, was mediated by men whose eyes and rituals were unseen yet omnipresent. This dynamic created a complex psychological hierarchy. While kings and nobles relied on the temple for legitimacy, commoners relied on it for survival. Failure to meet ritual obligations, ignorance of sacred rules, or even unintentional disrespect could have tangible consequences. People learned to attribute nearly everything that went wrong to some failure of protocol or oversight, a reflection of their position outside the inner sanctum of power. Markets, homes, and streets were filled with murmurs, speculations, and stories about priests' unseen judgments. These tales often grew more elaborate with repetition. A child lost to illness was whispered to have been cursed for disrespecting a sacred object. A poor harvest became proof that the village had angered the gods through human negligence. Fear and uncertainty spread like wildfire, reinforcing the priest's authority without their having to intervene directly in every case. The priest's exclusionary power was also reinforced by tangible demonstrations of knowledge and influence. Divination practices, often performed in secret chambers, allowed priests to make predictions about rainfall, harvest yields, or political events. When their prophecies came true, even partially, the results were interpreted as evidence of their divine connection and ability to control outcomes. For those outside the priesthood, this validation created a psychological chain. The more the priests appeared to know and manipulate events, the more deeply villagers internalized the notion that their exclusion was not only a matter of social rank, but of life and death. Ordinary citizens began to see themselves as perpetually under observation, vulnerable to forces they could not understand and powerless to influence outcomes except by meticulous adherence to the rituals, offerings, and instructions dictated by the temple. The manipulation of misfortune was subtle yet pervasive. Priests could amplify fears by attributing negative events to human error or divine displeasure, selectively offering guidance or intervention to those who complied. For example, if a plague swept through a community, priests might emphasize that it was the result of some failure in proper ritual practice. Those who sought remedies or advice had to follow the prescribed offerings and behaviors meticulously. Success was then framed as proof of divine favor, while failure was interpreted as confirmation of neglect or transgression. In this way, the temple became both a sanctuary and a source of terror, its influence extending beyond its physical boundaries into every household, field, and workplace. The power of exclusion was therefore not passive. It was an active instrument of social, spiritual, and psychological control. Even festivals, public ceremonies, and collective prayers reinforced this dynamic. While participation was often mandatory, the inner workings and outcomes of rituals remained concealed. Villagers could see priests performing their duties, hear chants echoing from sacred spaces, and witness offerings being made, but the precise meaning and effects of these actions remained inaccessible. The ambiguity served the temple well. Ordinary people were never entirely sure what their success or failure in complying would yield, reinforcing constant vigilance and deference. The inability to access the sacred knowledge created an environment where fear, respect, and obedience intertwined, ensuring that the priesthood's influence was perpetually felt, even in the absence of direct interaction. The priest's exclusionary power also affected social relationships within communities. Families taught their children the importance of piety, respect, and caution, instilling an early awareness that misfortune could strike those who strayed from prescribed behaviors. Neighbors watched neighbors, sometimes reporting suspected failures to temple authorities, ensuring communal enforcement of compliance. Gossip and rumor acted as extensions of the priest's authority, amplifying the sense that everyone was always under scrutiny. The veil of secrecy surrounding rituals and sacred knowledge allowed priests to manipulate these social mechanisms subtly, turning collective anxiety into a reinforcing loop of obedience and fear. Ordinary citizens internalized the belief that survival required vigilance, respect, and humility before forces they could not comprehend. The psychological burden of exclusion was profound. While priests were engaged in ritual and meditation, ordinary people were consumed by thoughts of misfortune, divine retribution, and hidden consequences. Superstitions flourished, often overlapping with the priest's teachings, creating a world in which unseen forces governed every action. Every illness, misfortune, or unexplained event became a cautionary tale, a reminder that the favor of the gods was mediated through human agents whose knowledge was inaccessible. Even when tangible aid or guidance was offered, it reinforced the notion that priests were intermediaries with unique power and insight. Ordinary citizens came to see their own limitations and vulnerabilities in stark relief, a constant reminder that exclusion was a curse with real-world implications. This atmosphere of pervasive fear and uncertainty had long-term societal effects. Communities became highly structured around rituals and offerings, with each household striving to maintain favor and avoid perceived transgressions. Social mobility was limited, as the most critical positions, those with direct access to the inner sanctum, remained reserved for the priestly elite. Economic, political, and personal decisions were influenced by the anticipation of divine scrutiny, and this influence extended into governance, trade, and family life. Even when priests were absent, their unseen presence was felt through the consequences attributed to human error, reinforcing the idea that exclusion from sacred knowledge was tantamount to vulnerability, even peril. Life outside the robes was, in effect, a life perpetually at the mercy of forces that one could neither understand nor control. The curse of exclusion also extended into legal and moral domains. When disputes arose, priests often acted as mediators, interpreting events according to divine law as they understood it. Their decisions were seen as final because of their sacred authority, and the knowledge they possessed placed them above ordinary judgment. Failure to adhere to the prescribed laws, rituals, or moral codes could result in blame for misfortune, further cementing their elevated status. Ordinary people, unable to access the inner workings of the temple or the hidden knowledge of the priests, were perpetually in a state of deference and caution, their lives shaped by the omnipresent but invisible power of the temple. Even the strongest and most independent individuals found themselves constrained. To question the priests or ignore ritual obligations was not merely a personal risk. It could bring collective consequences, as misfortunes were often seen as punishments affecting entire communities. The fear of bringing harm upon oneself, one's family, or one's village ensured widespread compliance. The priesthood's influence thus extended beyond individual relationships to the very structure of society, shaping behavior, thought, and belief. Exclusion was both a physical and psychological reality. Those outside the sacred order had limited recourse, limited protection, and limited understanding, yet were constantly aware that the power to harm or protect lay in unseen hands. Over time, this system of fear and exclusion became ingrained. Ordinary people accepted the existence of hidden rituals, secret knowledge, and the priesthood's ability to control events in ways beyond mortal comprehension. The fear of divine wrath mediated through human agents became a cornerstone of social and spiritual life. Misfortune was never random. It was interpreted as a reflection of status, behavior, or error. The invisible boundaries established by the priests created a society in which obedience was a survival mechanism and knowledge was the ultimate currency. The curse of exclusion was thus not merely symbolic. It was a pervasive lived experience that shaped generations of Sumerians, reinforcing the priesthood's supremacy and ensuring that ordinary lives were continually guided, constrained, and threatened by the unseen forces that controlled their world. In this way, the priest's dominance over those excluded from the sacred order became a defining feature of Sumerian civilization. Villagers and townsfolk, aware of their vulnerability, internalized the authority of the temple and perpetuated its influence through daily compliance, superstition, and fear. Life outside the robe was a precarious balance between devotion and anxiety, with every action scrutinized, every misfortune explained as punishment, and every blessing seen as proof of divine favor mediated through the priests. The curse of the excluded was a powerful tool, ensuring the continuation of a hierarchical society in which the few who held sacred knowledge ruled over the many, their power unquestioned and their presence perpetually felt. In the ancient cities of Sumer, where the mighty rivers of the Tigris and Euphrates carved fertile valleys and provided the lifeblood for growing populations, power was never a matter of brute force alone. It was an intricate web of authority, influence, and perception, in which kings and priests were bound together in a delicate, often tense relationship. The kings, adorned in robes of fine linen and gold, perched upon thrones that symbolized temporal power, were deeply reliant on the priesthood for legitimacy. Their authority, while outwardly absolute, was continuously validated through religious sanction. To rule without the blessing of the priests was to risk appearing illegitimate, vulnerable, and ultimately expendable. The temples, with their towering ziggurats and labyrinthine inner chambers, served as the sacred machinery through which kings could be crowned, decreed, and affirmed in the eyes of their people. Priests controlled the rituals, the symbols, and the divine narrative that enveloped the monarchy, making them indispensable in the eyes of rulers who understood that authority without sanctity was fragile. Yet this dependency was double-edged. While kings needed priests to confer legitimacy, the priests themselves wielded influence that could bend the throne to their will. Their knowledge of omens, divination, and secret rites gave them the ability to advise, manipulate, or even undermine rulers when opportunity presented itself. A king faced with political uncertainty, military threats, or public unrest often turned to the temple for guidance, seeking divine counsel in the form of priestly interpretations. Yet the priest's words were never neutral. Embedded within their guidance were subtle nudges, warnings, or predictions that could shape decisions, sway loyalties, or even justify acts of war. To the common citizen, a priest's pronouncement of displeasure from the gods might appear as the voice of inevitability. To the king, it was both counsel and caution, a reminder that the unseen powers controlling their city were as potent as the armies at their command. Kings, despite their outward displays of power, often learned the hard way that the priesthood's favor was not to be taken lightly. A misinterpreted omen, a neglected ritual, or even a perceived slight could have consequences for rulers as much as for ordinary citizens. Historical accounts tell of kings who hesitated to move against political rivals without consulting the priests, fearing that divine wrath, as interpreted by the temple, would follow. In some cases, priests could influence succession, supporting one heir over another, subtly ensuring that those who ascended the throne were amenable to their influence. It was an intricate dance. The king projected authority, issued decrees, and commanded armies, yet the priesthood's quiet hand could steer policy, law, and even the outcome of wars. The most astute priests recognized the power of suggestion, the weight of fear, and the sway of belief. By controlling the narrative of divine favor, they became pivotal players in the political theater. Their presence felt in every council, in every court, and in the deliberations that determined the fate of the realm. The tension between kings and priests was not always adversarial, but it was always strategic. Kings sought to co-opt religious authority, commissioning temples, commissioning grand festivals, and engaging in public acts of piety to signal alignment with the gods. Priests, in turn, demanded obedience, tribute, and respect, knowing that their cooperation was essential to maintain the king's image as a divinely sanctioned ruler. The interplay between the two powers created a unique political dynamic. Kings were both sovereign and subordinate, able to command armies, but reliant on priests to confer spiritual legitimacy. Priests were both servants and masters, performing rituals while holding sway over the most critical symbols of authority. Neither could function entirely without the other, yet each constantly assessed how much control or influence the other wielded, ever wary of the fragile balance that underpinned the governance of the city-state. Priestly influence extended beyond ceremony into law and social regulation. Kings often codified rules based on priestly counsel, ensuring that the populace followed decrees that aligned with religious expectations. Violations of sacred law, neglect of ritual duties, or failure to contribute to temple obligations were not merely spiritual offenses. They became legal and political issues. Priests could advocate for punishment, call attention to transgressions, or offer counsel on political matters framed as divine instruction. In doing so, they maintained authority over both spiritual and temporal spheres. Even the most formidable kings knew that the sway of public opinion could be shaped by the priest's interpretations, and that ignoring their counsel could spark unrest, rebellion, or the perception of impiety, a dangerous vulnerability in a society where divine favor was believed to underpin every element of life. Wars and conflicts further highlighted the priest's power. Before battles, kings would often consult the temple for omens, seeking assurances of victory or guidance on strategy. Priests, skilled in reading the stars, examining the entrails of animals, or interpreting the behavior of natural phenomena, provided counsel that could determine whether a campaign moved forward or was delayed. Their interpretations could embolden armies, justify preemptive strikes, or redirect resources. Yet the priest's motivations were not always aligned with the king's immediate ambitions. Some sought to maintain stability, while others manipulated outcomes to favor allies or relatives. The king's military decisions, critical for survival and prestige, were thus inseparable from the priest's perceived divine insights. In this way, control over interpretation became control over action. A priest's insight could shift the tide of war, legitimize conquest, or protect rivals, all under the guise of divine instruction. The everyday life of the populace reflected this relationship. Kings issued decrees and levied taxes, but the moral and spiritual justification often came from the priests. When a famine struck, or when disease swept through the streets, it was the priesthood that framed these events as divine tests or punishments, implicitly or explicitly holding the king accountable for failing to adhere to spiritual guidance. Citizens, accustomed to seeing priests as intermediaries with the gods, internalized their authority, amplifying their influence. Kings relied on this perception. A ruler who was visibly aligned with the temple appeared stronger, divinely sanctioned, and unassailable. A ruler who ignored the priests risked being perceived as arrogant, impious, or reckless, a dangerous misstep in a society where legitimacy was as much about perception as it was about might. This symbiotic, yet tension-filled relationship also shaped succession and governance. Priests could lend support to favored heirs, sway public opinion, or guide ceremonial practices that reinforced a particular lineage. Kings, aware of the priest's power, had to balance personal ambition with compliance to sacred norms. Political maneuvering within the palace or city-state often involved careful consideration of the temple's reaction. To challenge the priests too directly risked undermining authority, yet failing to assert control over spiritual matters could make a ruler appear weak. In this delicate interplay, priests exercised a form of soft power, their influence pervasive yet subtle, their authority cemented by centuries of tradition, belief, and the ever-present fear of divine wrath. The reach of priestly authority was further enhanced by the everyday practices imposed upon ordinary citizens. Ritual obligations, offerings, and festivals were designed to reinforce obedience and respect for the temple. Kings enforced these practices, sometimes personally participating, to signal alignment with divine will. The population, witnessing their rulers' adherence, internalized the hierarchy. Priests as interpreters of divine favor, kings as intermediaries executing sacred mandates, and the commoners as recipients of protection and judgment alike. In effect, the priest's power over kings ensured that the entire social order flowed from the temple's authority. Their ability to manipulate the throne influenced decisions and guide public perception made them both essential and feared a presence that shaped law, politics, and society in ways that were as tangible as the physical structures of ziggurats and palaces, and as invisible as the unseen hand of the divine. Even in moments of apparent harmony, the undercurrent of tension was palpable. Kings might publicly honor priests, build grand temples, and fund elaborate rituals, all the while being acutely aware of the delicate balance they maintained. Priests, in turn, wielded their power judiciously, ensuring compliance while maintaining the perception of impartiality and divine mandate. Their authority was reinforced by secrecy, knowledge of omens, and the public's belief in their ability to interpret the will of the gods. A single miscalculation, a poorly timed declaration, or a misinterpreted sign could shift the balance of influence, reminding both king and populace that the priest's power was neither absolute nor unchallenged, but perpetually felt. In sum, the relationship between kings and priests in Sumer was one of mutual dependency, strategic manipulation, and subtle control. Kings relied on priests to legitimize their rule, to sanctify their decrees, and to guide them in matters both political and spiritual. Priests, in turn, exploited this reliance, shaping law, influencing political decisions, and exerting control over society at large. Their ability to sway kings made them indispensable, yet feared, their position a blend of service and supremacy. Ordinary citizens, witnessing the intertwining of temporal and spiritual power, internalized the priest's authority, perceiving misfortune, success, and divine will as mediated through the sacred order. Exclusion from priestly knowledge was not merely a social limitation, but a fundamental vulnerability, and the interplay between throne and temple created a society in which power, fear, and reverence were inseparable, each reinforcing the other in a delicate, unyielding balance that defined life in ancient Sumer. In the cities and villages of ancient Sumer, life was fragile, subject to the whims of the unpredictable rivers, the harsh sun, and the caprices of both gods and humans. In this precarious world, illness and injury were constant threats. Disease could sweep through a settlement within days. Injuries from labor or accidents left people vulnerable, and mental distress or fear of the supernatural weighed heavily on the populace. In such a context, the priesthood rose not only as spiritual intermediaries, but also as the primary arbiters of health and well-being. Their temples were repositories of sacred knowledge, stores of remedies, and centers for rituals designed to protect, heal, or punish. Those who fell ill, whether from natural causes or misfortune, came to the priests seeking intervention, convinced that the hands of the divine were present in every potion, every chant, every prayer, and every ceremonial act. The priest's role as healer was inseparable from their spiritual authority. To question one was to challenge both. The Sumerian priests were trained from a young age, schooled in the complex traditions of medicine, incantation, astrology, and divination. They memorized long liturgies, learned the properties of herbs and minerals, and studied the subtle signs of the body and the environment that could indicate imbalance or impending danger. A cough, a fever, a sudden convulsion, or even behavioral changes were interpreted through a dual lens, one part physiological, one part divine. Remedies included preparations of herbs, careful diets, incantations, and ritual purification, often administered in elaborate ceremonies that reinforced the priest's power and the sacred nature of the intervention. When these measures succeeded, the priest's reputation grew, their authority strengthened, and the people's belief in their divine connection deepened. Healing was evidence of both skill and favor, and the priest stood as the bridge between mortality and the favor of the gods. Yet, as with all power in Sumer, healing was inseparable from fear. Success elevated the priest, but failure could be explained in a way that preserved authority while reinforcing dread. When a patient succumbed despite remedies, it was never because of error or limitation. It was because the gods were displeased, the victim had committed transgression, or the people themselves had failed to honor sacred obligations. The priest's authority was thus insulated. Triumphs were attributed to skill and divine favor, while disasters became proof of cosmic punishment, of a world in which the priest's insight was the only means of navigating danger. This duality made the priest both revered and feared, a figure whose judgment touched the most intimate aspects of life and death. The priest's control over healing also extended to matters of psychological and spiritual affliction. Madness, anxiety, or prolonged grief were interpreted as signs of possession, curses, or spiritual imbalance. Priests performed exorcisms, rituals, and chants designed to purge harmful forces, their procedures often terrifying to onlookers, yet highly respected. The mere performance of such rites reinforced the idea that misfortune could strike anyone at any time, and that only the priest possessed the knowledge and authority to mediate it. Villagers internalized this power dynamic, learning that health and protection were contingent upon obedience, respect, and regular participation in temple rituals. The threat of divine wrath, combined with observable interventions, created a feedback loop in which fear, reverence, and dependence reinforced one another. In some cases, priests used their knowledge for more sinister ends. Certain herbs, poisons, or manipulations of ritual could harm as much as heal. Threats of curses, ritualized punishments, or concealed potions could eliminate enemies or assert dominance over local communities. A sickly child, a disputing neighbor, or a rebellious worker could all be subject to subtle coercion framed as divine intervention. Ordinary citizens, often unable to distinguish between natural illness and supernatural punishment, were left with little recourse but faith and obedience. These practices further cemented the priesthood's aura of power. The knowledge of harm, coupled with visible ability to heal, placed the priests in a position where questioning their authority was tantamount to courting disaster. The dual role of Sumerian priests as both doctors and spiritual intermediaries was reinforced through ceremony and observation. Treatments were rarely simple. They involved a combination of verbal ritual, physical care, and symbolic acts that reminded both patient and observer that the priest's authority was absolute. A simple application of herb might be accompanied by prayers, incantations, and symbolic gestures to the gods, with strict rules governing the behavior of the patient and attendants. Compliance was expected and reinforced through fear. Breaking protocol could lead to worsened conditions, interpreted as punishment for disrespect. This meticulous blending of medical intervention and spiritual oversight created an environment in which the priest's actions, whether successful or not, reinforced the perception of divine control, and by extension, the priest's indispensable power. The priest's influence was not limited to the sickroom. Their expertise in healing intersected with law, politics, and social management. A disease outbreak in one quarter of a city could justify restrictions, quarantine, or ritual offerings. The priest's counsel guided the king and administrators in public health, often with little oversight. Accusations of sorcery, negligence, or impiety could be leveraged to target rivals or assert dominance within the city hierarchy. Citizens learned that the priesthood was the arbiter not only of spiritual life, but of physical safety, social standing, and public order. Their judgments, whether in the form of treatment or interpretation, were rarely questioned without risk of reprisal, divine or human. In understanding Sumerian society, it becomes clear that the priest's role as healer was inseparable from their broader control. The lines between medicine, ritual, and social power were intentionally blurred. Healing was never merely an act of alleviating pain. It was an assertion of authority, a demonstration of divine favor, and a reinforcement of social hierarchy. The priest mediated life and death, health and disease, fear and reassurance, in ways that cemented the temple as the locus of both spiritual and temporal power. Every consultation, every prescription, every ritual reinforced the delicate but potent control that the priesthood exercised over kings, citizens, and the city itself. Even ordinary observations of the natural world fed into this authority. Seasonal changes, flood patterns, or unexpected pestilence were interpreted through the priest's framework. They declared what was auspicious and what was forbidden, who was at risk, and what actions might avert disaster. This continuous mediation of the unseen, disease, misfortune, divine favor, ensured that the priest's role as healer, advisor, and enforcer remained central to every aspect of Sumerian life. Knowledge and secrecy were tools of both protection and power, and the citizens, aware of their vulnerability, deferred to those who could claim understanding of forces beyond human comprehension. In conclusion, Sumerian priests were far more than spiritual guides. They were doctors, exorcists, interpreters, and enforcers, wielding control over life, health, and society. Their cures, whether effective or not, were framed as evidence of divine favor. Their failures were framed as the punishment of impiety, ensuring that fear, reverence, and obedience coexisted in equal measure. This dual role, combining the tangible skills of medicine with the intangible authority of divine sanction, made priests central to the functioning of Sumerian civilization. Citizens, kings, and rulers all depended on their guidance, aware that challenging their authority could bring illness, misfortune, or worse. Through their mastery of both healing and harm, Sumerian priests solidified their position as the most feared, respected, and essential figures in the ancient world, shaping society in ways that were as profound as they were enduring. In the sprawling cities and villages of Sumer, life for ordinary citizens was a precarious balance of labor, devotion, and fear. The rhythm of daily existence was dictated not only by the seasons and the flooding of the rivers, but also by the ever-present authority of the priesthood. These men, robed in fine linen, adorned with sacred symbols, and trained from youth in the arcane arts of ritual, medicine, and divination, occupied a sphere far above that of the common folk. To see a priest in the marketplace, to hear the chants from the temple, or to witness the performance of a ritual was a constant reminder of the power they wielded. Yet despite the omnipresent aura of authority and the warnings of curses, misfortune, or divine retribution, there were always those who entertained the dangerous idea of defiance. The temptation to push back, to claim a sliver of autonomy from the priest's rigid control, was an ever-present but perilous impulse among ordinary citizens. The sources of temptation were manifold. Farmers, merchants, and laborers toiled under the burden of offerings, tithes, and fees exacted by the temple. A poor harvest, a sudden flood, or the spread of disease could decimate a family's livelihood, and yet the priest remained untouchable, demanding obedience and tribute in equal measure. Citizens might look upon these figures with a mix of awe and simmering resentment. The priests held knowledge of remedies and rituals that could alleviate suffering or ensure survival, yet their own lives were largely insulated from the hardship and danger experienced by those they governed spiritually and socially. To some, the contrast between the luxury of the temple and the privation of daily life sparked thoughts of rebellion or subversion. These thoughts could take many forms: refusing to pay tribute, secretly ignoring rituals, attempting to bypass priestly authority in resolving disputes, or speaking disparagingly in hushed tones about the temple's influence. However, the consequences of such temptations were swift and often brutal. The priest's network of informants was extensive, spanning households, marketplaces, and even neighboring villages. Gossip and rumor were potent tools, and anyone suspected of dissent risked being accused of offending the gods. It was said that even a misdirected glance or a whispered word could invoke the wrath of the divine, but in practice, these warnings were enforced through human agency. Fines, public humiliation, seizure of property, or even imprisonment. The common folk learned early that resistance carried a high price. This omnipresent surveillance and the ever-present threat of punishment reinforced obedience, and yet human nature being what it is, defiance never disappeared entirely. The psychology of temptation is a subtle, persistent force. Individuals might rationalize small acts of defiance, skipping a ritual, taking more than their fair share of grain, or quietly ignoring a priest's commands, thinking that minor infractions would escape notice. But the priests were adept at maintaining an appearance of omniscience. They leveraged fear and superstition to make every citizen feel watched, observed, and judged. Children were taught from an early age to revere and fear the priest, and the adults' knowledge of the consequences of disobedience further compounded the atmosphere of intimidation. This psychological control created a society in which even fleeting thoughts of rebellion were tempered by the knowledge of what could happen if those thoughts became actions. Occasionally, attempts at defiance escalated into larger-scale efforts. Villagers might band together to resist an excessive tithe, to bypass the priestly monopoly on grain storage, or to ignore temple mandates in the hope of retaining more of their own produce. Such rebellions, however, were rare and invariably doomed. The priest's influence over kings, city councils, and military forces meant that even the most determined insurrection was crushed quickly and decisively. Rebellions were framed as evidence of divine punishment, attributed to the hubris or wickedness of the dissenters rather than flaws in the system. Stories circulated widely of villages where citizens attempted to defy the priests and were subsequently struck by disease, famine, or misfortune, reinforcing the belief that rebellion invited disaster. These narratives served a dual purpose. They eliminated opposition and reinforced the psychological grip that the priesthood maintained over the populace. Even when punishment did not come in the form of direct physical coercion, The priest's power manifested in other, equally effective ways. Social ostracization was a constant threat. Dissenters were excluded from festivals, forbidden from receiving temple blessings, and denied the protection of communal rituals. Marriages could be delayed or blocked, property rights called into question, and accusations of impiety spread quickly, often fueled by neighbors eager to curry favor with the temple. Fear of being singled out, of being blamed for misfortune, or of attracting the attention of divine wrath kept most ordinary citizens compliant. Those who did attempt defiance often found themselves isolated, struggling against a social and spiritual system that was far larger and more entrenched than any single person could overcome. It is important to understand the subtlety of the priest's methods. Control was not only enforced through overt punishment, but also through the cultivation of internalized fear. People came to police themselves, fearing the invisible eyes of the gods and the visible judgment of the temple. The priesthood understood that a frightened population was a controllable population. Rumors of curses, whispers of secret rituals, and the careful maintenance of arcane knowledge ensured that the ordinary folk never felt secure enough to act against the established order. This internalized fear was perhaps more effective than any punishment, as it led individuals to preemptively restrain their impulses toward rebellion, ensuring obedience even when no immediate threat was present. Yet, despite the suffocating control, human resilience and the desire for autonomy persisted. Some individuals sought small victories in secrecy, sharing forbidden knowledge, hiding grain, or practicing folk remedies outside the temple's supervision. These acts, while minor, represented the human spirit's resistance to absolute authority. They were fleeting moments in which ordinary citizens could assert agency in a world dominated by priests who seemed to hold sway over every aspect of life. The priests, in turn, were vigilant, aware of these small acts of defiance, and quick to respond when they threatened the broader structure of control. Punishments for discovery were carefully calibrated to both eliminate the immediate act of defiance and to serve as a warning to others who might be tempted. The intersection of fear and rebellion was also evident in the ways the priests manipulated religion itself. They interpreted natural disasters, crop failures, or outbreaks of disease as signs of divine displeasure, often attributing them to the secret sins or disobedience of citizens. By framing misfortune in this way, they transformed acts of defiance or moral lapses into cosmic warnings, reinforcing their indispensability. A village suffering from famine was reminded that the priest's guidance, rituals, and sacrifices were the only means of appeasing the gods. Attempts to resist or to bypass priestly authority thus became fraught with spiritual as well as social risk. The population, aware of the catastrophic consequences of angering the divine, learned to internalize submission as survival. The psychological grip extended to children as well, who were trained from early age to recognize the dangers of temptation and disobedience. Lessons about the priest's powers were woven into daily life, and stories of punishment, divine wrath, and miraculous cures circulated widely. As these children matured, the lessons solidified into ingrained respect, fear, and obedience. The temptation to rebel, though never completely extinguished, was tempered by a lifetime of conditioning. Even adults, despite occasional frustration, recognized the futility of defiance when faced with an institution that could sanction both the spiritual and temporal consequences of rebellion. The priest's ability to intertwine religion, health, and social order created a system where temptation and resistance were continuously weighed against the omnipresent threat of punishment and misfortune. In rare instances, acts of defiance did lead to change, often subtle and localized rather than revolutionary. Citizens might petition for minor relief from tithes, secure limited autonomy in daily work, or negotiate compromises with local temple authorities. Yet even these small victories were framed as blessings granted by the priests, rather than concessions forced by the people. By controlling the narrative, The priesthood maintained the appearance of absolute authority while allowing minimal flexibility that did not threaten the overall structure. This careful management of perception ensured that the temptation of rebellion never grew into a sustained challenge, keeping the ordinary folk dependent and cautious. Ultimately, the temptation of the common folk and the priest's response to it illuminates the intricate web of control in Sumerian society. Authority was reinforced through fear, surveillance, social manipulation, and religious doctrine. Acts of defiance were treated as dangerous provocations, punished swiftly and publicly to serve as cautionary tales. Yet human curiosity, ambition, and the desire for autonomy persisted, manifesting in subtle attempts at resistance that were constantly monitored and suppressed. The priest's mastery of both tangible and intangible tools, knowledge, ritual, punishment, and the framing of misfortune, ensured that even temptation itself became a controlled element of social life. Citizens were aware of the peril inherent in defiance, and this awareness kept society functioning under a careful balance of reverence, obedience, and fear. In this light, the narrative of ordinary Sumerians resisting or being tempted to resist their spiritual overlords is not merely a story of oppression. It is also a testament to the psychological complexity of power. The priest's ability to manipulate fear, reputation, and belief created an environment in which the line between natural misfortune and divine punishment was blurred. The ordinary people learned to navigate these dangers, weighing temptation against risk, compliance against survival. It was a society in which rebellion was both a desire and a peril, an impulse constrained at every turn by the all-encompassing presence of the priesthood. Through these dynamics, the priests solidified their position not only as spiritual leaders, but as ultimate arbiters of both life and the very choices that defined it. In the complex tapestry of Sumerian society, priests occupied a position that seemed unassailable. Their robes, adorned with sacred symbols, their knowledge of rituals, divination, and writing, and their control over grain, law, and the interpretation of omens, gave them immense authority over both kings and commoners alike. Yet, despite the aura of invincibility that surrounded them, the lives of priests were anything but secure. The very instruments that elevated them above ordinary citizens, their knowledge, influence, and proximity to the divine, also made them vulnerable to the shifting currents of politics, human jealousy, and the unpredictable whims of fate. Power, even in its most sacred guise, was fragile, and the fall of a priest could be as dramatic and devastating as the rise had been meteoric. The mechanisms by which a priest could fall from favor were varied and often intertwined. Political rivalries within the temple and the royal court could undermine even the most respected figures. A priest who had long held authority over temple rituals, grain stores, and interpretations of celestial events might suddenly find themselves accused of negligence, incompetence, or impiety. Envy among peers, who had spent years watching, learning, and waiting for a misstep, could transform minor lapses into charges of serious offense. In an environment where perception often mattered more than reality, a whispered rumor, a misinterpreted sign, or a failed ritual could be construed as evidence of wrongdoing. Such accusations, once made, carried weight beyond the individual's control, as the social, political, and spiritual order relied on the maintenance of fear and obedience. To protect the system, the temple hierarchy often acted swiftly, removing or punishing priests who were perceived as a threat to the institution's integrity. The stakes were amplified by the priest's relationship with the king. In Sumer, kings depended on priests for legitimacy. Ceremonies, proclamations, and interpretations of divine will were mediated through the temple. A priest's failure to correctly read the omens, to ensure a successful harvest, or to avert a calamity could be viewed not simply as incompetence, but as a sign of divine displeasure, a dangerous reflection upon the king himself. Political factions within the palace would seize upon these failures, framing the priest's misfortune as evidence of treachery, bribery, or corruption. Even when the priest had acted with complete fidelity and expertise, the capricious nature of human perception, compounded by fear and superstition, meant that they could be cast into disgrace. The court and temple were interdependent, yet precariously balanced, and a shift in favor from one influential individual could spell the end for another. Accusations of failure were not always based on politics or envy. Nature itself, unpredictable and unforgiving, could catalyze a priest's downfall. A flood that destroyed crops, a famine that swept through villages, or an outbreak of disease could be interpreted as the direct result of a priest's negligence or angering of the gods. In a society where divine favor was mediated exclusively through the temple, such misfortunes required explanation, and the priest on duty became a convenient scapegoat. This was particularly dangerous during critical ceremonies, such as those intended to secure the success of planting or harvest, or rituals aimed at appeasing the gods during times of drought or epidemic. If these ceremonies were unsuccessful, even through no fault of the priest, the consequences were severe. Exile, public humiliation, loss of position, and, in extreme cases, execution were all real possibilities for those who had once commanded reverence and obedience. The social and psychological ramifications of this precarious position were profound. Priests lived in constant awareness of their vulnerability, a paradoxical existence where the same skills, knowledge, and rituals that conferred immense respect could also precipitate disaster. They were acutely conscious of the fact that their fortunes could shift in an instant. A failed divination could undermine their authority. A rival's rumor could erode their reputation, or a natural disaster could render their expertise irrelevant. The result was an environment of hypervigilance, where every action, every word, and every gesture was carefully measured against the potential for misinterpretation. Even the slightest mistake could be seized upon as evidence of incompetence or impiety. Priests developed an acute awareness of the fragile nature of human favor and learned to navigate a world in which social, political, and spiritual survival were constantly at risk. Despite the fear and vulnerability inherent in their roles, priests did not exist in isolation. Networks of patronage, alliances with other temple officials, and relationships with influential citizens or members of the royal household were essential for maintaining stability and safety. A priest who had cultivated strong support among allies could survive accusations or missteps, while those who neglected these connections found themselves increasingly exposed. Alliances were delicate, often shifting in response to political tides, personal rivalries, and the whims of those in power. Even a well-established priest could be undone if their network of supporters weakened, if a rival gained influence, or if the king's favor shifted toward another. This reliance on external validation highlighted the complex interplay between personal competence, political acumen, and fortune in determining a priest's survival. Falling from favor was rarely sudden. It was often the culmination of gradual erosion. Minor errors, initially overlooked, could be amplified by gossip, misinterpretation, and opportunistic rivals. A priest might find themselves increasingly marginalized within temple administration, losing responsibilities and influence over time. Public perception, meticulously crafted through ritual performance and displays of piety, could falter when compounded by these pressures. In some cases, priests attempted to preempt their fall by appeasing influential figures, performing additional ceremonies, or demonstrating extraordinary devotion. Yet even these efforts could fail, particularly if rivals manipulated events or if natural calamities cast doubt on their competence. The tension between personal agency and external forces defined the precarious existence of the Sumerian priesthood. The consequences of losing favor were not purely professional. They carried profound personal and spiritual implications. Priests who fell from grace often faced ostracism, loss of income, and deprivation of social standing. Their families could be implicated, subject to reduced support, stigma, or exclusion from communal activities. Furthermore, the perception of divine disfavor could shadow their remaining years, as ordinary citizens interpreted any further misfortune as confirmation of guilt. A priest's fall from favor thus served as a cautionary tale, reinforcing the authority of remaining officials and perpetuating the climate of fear that underpinned the entire system. The dramatic reversals of fortune among priests were a constant reminder that power, even when cloaked in sacred authority, was not immune to the forces of politics, envy, and chance. In some historical accounts, the fall of a priest catalyzed broader societal changes. When influential priests were removed, power vacuums emerged, creating opportunities for rivals or ambitious newcomers. These transitions could destabilize the administration of grain, the interpretation of omens, or the performance of rituals critical to civic and agricultural life. Ordinary citizens, who had learned to rely on the stability provided by the temple, were forced to adapt quickly, sometimes enduring further uncertainty, stricter enforcement, or heightened fear of punishment. The intricate relationship between priestly favor, political power, and social order meant that the personal fortunes of individual priests had ripple effects that extended far beyond the temple walls. At its core, the narrative of priests falling out of favor illustrates the complex and often perilous nature of authority in Sumer. While priests wielded immense influence over kings and commoners, their power was never absolute, and their positions were inherently unstable. Success required not only mastery of rituals, knowledge of divine will, and social acumen, but also vigilance against political intrigue, envy, and misfortune. The very skills that elevated them made them conspicuous, vulnerable to accusation, and ultimately expendable when circumstances shifted. The precariousness of their position reinforced the broader lesson that in Sumerian society, no one, regardless of proximity to the divine, was entirely safe from the tides of fortune, assumption, and human ambition. Even as they navigated this treacherous landscape, priests remained central to the functioning of Sumerian civilization. Their expertise in agriculture, law, medicine, and divination was indispensable, and their ability to mediate between humans and gods ensured social cohesion. Yet, the shadow of potential disgrace loomed constantly, a reminder that authority was as much a liability as it was a privilege. The fall of a priest was a spectacle that reinforced the power of the system, served as a warning to others, and reminded citizens that the sacred and the temporal were deeply intertwined. In understanding this dynamic, the precariousness of priestly authority becomes clear. The very structures that enabled dominance also contain the seeds of vulnerability. Through the lens of history, the rise and fall of Sumerian priests provides insight into the fragile balance between power, fear, and survival. Even the most exalted individuals were subject to the forces of human ambition, natural calamity, and political maneuvering. Their influence over kings, laws, and the common folk was immense, but it was neither guaranteed nor eternal. Each priest lived with the knowledge that their fall could be sudden, their disgrace total, and their legacy marred. In a world where divine will, human perception, and the whims of fortune intersected, the temptation to overreach, the missteps of performance, or the machinations of rivals could result in complete reversal. The story of priests falling from favor is thus a powerful testament to the volatility of authority, the fragility of social standing, and the ever-present tension between power and vulnerability in Sumerian society. In Sumerian society, the shadow of the priesthood stretched across every facet of daily life, shaping behavior, choices, and even the rhythm of the seasons. Their influence was subtle and overt, woven into the laws that governed marriages, the trade that sustained families, and the labor that kept fields productive. To live under the watchful eye of a priest was to navigate a complex network of rules, customs, and unspoken expectations, where every action could be scrutinized and interpreted as either acceptable or an affront to divine order. The power they wielded was not only spiritual, but profoundly practical, dictating how the population lived, worked, and interacted with one another, while instilling a pervasive fear that the gods themselves could punish any misstep. Marriage, one of the most personal of human affairs, was heavily influenced by the temple. Priests acted as mediators and witnesses, their approval considered essential to ensure that the union had divine blessing. A couple who wished to marry often had to present offerings, participate in specific rituals, and sometimes endure examinations of lineage and conduct. It was not merely an administrative procedure. Failure to gain priestly favor could mark a marriage with suspicion, potentially leading to gossip, social ostracism, or the belief that the household would suffer misfortune. Families lived in awareness that a priest's censure, or even the perception of it, could invite drought, disease, or other calamities, making obedience to their decrees a matter of survival, not just faith. Trade and economic activity were equally influenced by the temple. Merchants and artisans conducted their business under the watchful eye of priests, who regulated marketplaces and controlled the storage of grain and other vital resources. Taxes, tithes, and offerings were collected regularly, and priests determined when these payments were due, often using the cycles of the moon or omens from the heavens to justify timing. To fail in these obligations was not merely an economic error. It was interpreted as a moral and spiritual failing, risking the wrath of both human authority and divine judgment. A shopkeeper who attempted to hide profits, cheat a customer, or bypass ritual obligations could find themselves publicly shamed, fined, or accused of blasphemy, a charge that could lead to imprisonment or corporal punishment. The omnipresence of the priestly gaze meant that citizens could never conduct their affairs in isolation. Every transaction carried a spiritual weight that demanded careful consideration. Labor, from tending fields to crafting pottery, was likewise bound by priestly oversight. Calendars dictated work schedules, with certain days reserved for religious observances, temple offerings, or rituals to ensure good fortune. Farmers might be required to present part of their harvest to the temple, and failure to comply could result in accusations of disobedience or disrespect. The priest's role in interpreting omens and celestial signs meant that even natural events, such as unexpected floods or late frosts, were often framed as divine punishment for human error, further reinforcing their authority. Laborers and artisans worked in a constant state of awareness that their productivity, adherence to ritual, and respect for sacred customs were being monitored, not just by human supervisors, but by a priestly hierarchy with the power to shape their fortunes. Beyond these structured aspects of life, the psychological influence of priests was profound. Fear, as much as faith, dictated behavior. Citizens often obeyed, not because they fully understood the rituals or believed in the outcomes, but because the potential consequences of disobedience were terrifyingly concrete in their minds. The mere rumor of a priest's curse could halt a trade, delay a harvest, or prevent a wedding. Parents would caution children to speak respectfully, to avoid misinterpreted glances or gestures, and to perform even the smallest domestic tasks in a manner pleasing to the gods, as interpreted by the priesthood. Daily routines were infused with caution, the invisible presence of spiritual authority shaping thought and action in ways both subtle and absolute. Even informal social interactions were tempered by the shadow of the temple. Complaints, jokes, or expressions of frustration had to be carefully moderated. A careless word could be reported to a priest and transformed into evidence of impiety. Neighbors became wary of each other, knowing that human reporting was as consequential as divine oversight. Gossip, though seemingly benign, carried risks. It could be twisted to support accusations of wrongdoing, and ordinary citizens quickly learned that social harmony depended on navigating the unspoken rules enforced by the priesthood. In this way, priests exerted control not only through direct intervention, but also through the shaping of communal norms and expectations. Fear of spiritual punishment, reinforced by human enforcers, created an intricate social web in which obedience was both pragmatic and existential. The impact of priestly authority extended to children and education. Boys and girls were raised with constant awareness of the gods and the priests who interpreted their will. From an early age, children were taught to perform gestures of respect, offer small sacrifices, and follow rules that seemed arbitrary, but were understood as essential for avoiding divine displeasure. Storytelling, parables, and fables often reinforced the moral and spiritual lessons decreed by the temple, embedding obedience in the very consciousness of the next generation. Education itself was controlled by the priesthood, as scribes often trained in temple schools were instructed in writing, ritual knowledge, and divination. Even literacy carried a spiritual dimension, as the ability to record events, interpret omens, and transmit sacred texts was framed as a divine responsibility. Those who could not access this education remained dependent, further reinforcing social hierarchies. Religious festivals and communal ceremonies were another avenue through which priestly influence permeated daily life. These events, while ostensibly joyous, served multiple functions. They reinforced the social order, displayed the wealth and power of the temple, and demonstrated the consequences of disobedience to both gods and humans. Participation was compulsory for citizens, who were expected to contribute offerings, perform assigned roles, and display proper decorum. Non-compliance, whether intentional or accidental, could be interpreted as sacrilege, with repercussions ranging from fines to public reprimand. The visibility of these rituals ensured that everyone observed the power dynamics of the temple firsthand, internalizing the message that obedience was essential for survival and prosperity. The influence of priests was also evident in the management of justice and law. Priests often acted as judges or advisors, interpreting sacred texts to resolve disputes. Their rulings were considered authoritative, with divine backing, and could override secular considerations. Accusations of theft, adultery, or negligence were weighed not just in human terms, but against the backdrop of religious expectations. A verdict from a priest could elevate or ruin a family, and fear of spiritual retribution ensured compliance with both moral and legal codes. The intersection of law, religion, and daily life created a society in which individual autonomy was constrained by an omnipresent hierarchy that demanded obedience, respect, and vigilance. Even leisure and recreation were tempered by priestly authority. Games, music, and social gatherings often occurred under the watchful eyes of temple officials or within the context of ritual observance. Activities that distracted from religious duties, disrespected sacred spaces, or flouted moral expectations were frowned upon or punished. The boundaries between secular enjoyment and spiritual duty were tightly controlled, ensuring that all aspects of life, including moments of rest or pleasure, reinforced the centrality of the priesthood. Citizens learned to navigate this duality, finding small ways to assert individuality while maintaining outward compliance to the omnipresent religious hierarchy. In agriculture, the most vital sector of Sumerian life, priests wielded exceptional authority. They determined planting schedules, predicted harvest outcomes, and performed rituals intended to appease the gods and ensure fertility of the land. Farmers relied on these directives to protect their livelihoods, and failure to follow guidance could be interpreted as sacrilege. The temple's control over grain stores amplified this power, as priests could influence distribution and storage, thereby exerting pressure on the population. Even a minor miscalculation or delay could result in scarcity, forcing communities to comply more strictly with priestly instructions. Fear of divine wrath, mediated by priestly authority, ensured that obedience remained consistent, and any deviation could be remembered and punished in future cycles. Marriage customs, trade, labor, festivals, education, law, leisure, and agriculture all were deeply entwined with the influence of the priesthood. The shadow they cast was pervasive, creating a society in which obedience was motivated as much by fear as by faith. Every decision carried weight, every interaction had potential consequences, and every failure could be interpreted as inviting divine retribution. Ordinary citizens internalized these pressures, learning to navigate a world in which the sacred and the mundane were inseparable, where the presence of the temple was inescapable, and where survival required careful observation of both human and divine expectations. The legacy of this pervasive authority extended beyond the immediate actions of the priests themselves. Generations grew up under systems designed to instill obedience and fear, internalizing the belief that the gods acted through their earthly representatives. Social cohesion was maintained not merely by law or tradition, but by the constant visible and invisible reminders of what could happen when one failed to respect the sacred hierarchy. Even minor transgressions, mistakes, or perceived slights were interpreted through the lens of priestly authority, ensuring that the influence of the temple remained strong across time and circumstance. In reflecting on everyday life under the shadow of Sumerian priests, it becomes evident that their power was both subtle and absolute. Their presence shaped actions, thoughts, and even emotions, cultivating a society in which fear and faith intertwined to enforce compliance. Citizens learned to live with the constant awareness that their fortunes, health, and social standing were intertwined with the approval or disapproval of the priesthood. In this intricate web of influence, the priest's authority was reinforced by the very people they governed, a cycle of power, obedience, and fear that defined life in ancient Sumer. The reach of the priesthood was total, touching marriages, trade, work, festivals, law, and personal behavior, leaving no aspect of daily life untouched and ensuring that their shadow endured across generations, unbroken and omnipresent. In the long history of Sumerian civilization, priests were not merely figures of religious authority. They were the architects of perception, shaping belief as much as law. Over time, their deeds, both real and imagined, became enshrined in myths and legends, stories whispered in marketplaces, recounted by traveling merchants, or murmured in the flickering candlelight of family homes. These tales were not simply entertainment. They were tools of social control, reinforcing the priesthood's power through fear, awe, and reverence. Every story told of a priest's cunning, cruelty, or ability to command divine forces reminded the populace that the temple's influence extended far beyond the walls of the ziggurat or the administration of grain stores. These legends were alive in the minds of the people, shaping how they understood the world and their place within it. One common theme in these narratives was the cunning manipulation of the gods themselves. Stories described priests who could summon storms, droughts, or floods with a whispered incantation, who could call down disease upon villages that failed to honor their rituals, or whose touch could bless or curse a household for generations. In reality, priests observed natural patterns and acted with intelligence and foresight. Their understanding of agriculture, weather, and medicine allowed them to appear magical. But these practical skills, amplified in oral tradition, transformed into tales of omnipotent control. A failed harvest became a demonstration of divine wrath channeled by an ever-watchful priest. A sudden illness was attributed to the hidden malice of someone who had drawn the gods' attention. Over time, the line between reality and legend blurred, giving priests a reputation that made even kings cautious of their power. Many of these stories emphasized punishment for disobedience or hubris. They depicted ordinary citizens, or even nobles, who dared to question priestly authority, only to suffer terrible fates. A merchant who neglected to offer the proper tribute would find his goods ruined by unseen forces. A villager who mocked a ritual would lose livestock or fall ill mysteriously. These narratives, repeated and embellished, reinforced the social order. They were cautionary tales, warnings that obedience was not merely prudent but essential. To defy the priests was to flirt with disaster on both a personal and communal scale. Fear was thus woven into culture, transmitted through generations as oral tradition and folklore, ensuring that even those who never encountered a priest directly internalized the hierarchy's authority. The stories also served to magnify the mystique surrounding priestly knowledge. Priests were said to possess secret wisdom and understanding of the cosmos, hidden herbs that could heal or kill, and arcane incantations that could alter fate itself. Legends spoke of a priest who, knowing the right prayers and sacrifices, could call back the dead or foretell events years in advance. Others told of priests who held the power to reveal unfaithfulness, uncover crimes, or expose treachery merely through observation and divine insight. Whether or not these abilities were factual, the stories reinforced the idea that priests were untouchable, their influence unassailable. Ordinary people, lacking access to literacy and sacred texts, relied on these narratives to interpret events beyond their comprehension, further cementing the priesthood's mystique. Some tales went beyond fear and delved into resentment, portraying priests as cunning manipulators who enriched themselves at the expense of ordinary citizens. Legends recounted instances where priests extracted excessive tithes, demanded sacrifices, or misappropriated resources, while the populace suffered famine or hardship. A village might survive a harsh winter, but find that the temple's granaries were full, having been reserved for the priestly elite. These stories acknowledged the human side of priests, their flaws, ambitions, and sometimes cruelty, while framing these traits as part of a larger divine mandate. Even as villagers grumbled or plotted in secret, the power of the narrative ensured that overt defiance remained rare. The tales balanced fear with moral caution. Priests could be flawed, yes, but challenging them invited catastrophe. Oral traditions also preserved accounts of priestly cunning in politics. Stories told of priests who advised kings, maneuvered to influence succession, or guided military campaigns. In some legends, a single priest could alter the fate of an entire city or dynasty, using knowledge of omens and rituals to shape decisions to their advantage. The populace viewed these figures as shadowy architects of power, invisible but omnipresent, capable of controlling outcomes far beyond their temples. Even those who sought personal advancement had to navigate the priestly influence. The myths served as reminders that the priest's reach extended into the very halls of kings, intertwining spiritual authority with temporal power. Fear, admiration, and grudging respect coexisted in the collective imagination, reinforcing the priest's dominance over both mundane and extraordinary aspects of life. These myths often incorporated elements of punishment and reward, illustrating the moral universe controlled by the priesthood. A successful harvest, a child born healthy, or a disease cured was evidence of a priest's favor, and by extension, the god's benevolence. Conversely, misfortune was rarely considered random. A plague, crop failure, or accident could be interpreted as the result of neglecting ritual obligations, slighting the gods, or failing to heed the priest's guidance. In this way, myths and legends acted as a moral compass for society, teaching obedience, humility, and reverence. Even the most skeptical villager might hesitate before acting against the temple, aware that history, amplified through story, seemed to demonstrate that defiance led to disaster. The narrative power of these stories was strengthened by their repetition across generations. Parents recounted tales to children at dusk, traveling merchants shared accounts of faraway villages, and festivals often reenacted legendary events to impress upon attendees the consequences of obedience and transgression. Over time, the line between lived experience and legend blurred. Historical events, droughts, floods, epidemics, political upheaval were reframed as lessons orchestrated by the priesthood. Priests became not just interpreters of divine will, but the very agents through which it was enacted. The effect was profound. Entire communities internalized a worldview where priests were the ultimate arbiters of life, health, fortune, and misfortune. Even in humor and casual storytelling, the shadow of priests was evident. Fables often included clever priests who outwitted kings or villagers, or alternatively, harsh priests whose punishments were just and terrifying. These stories entertained, instructed, and subtly reinforced the hierarchy of power. They offered a shared cultural language in which fear, respect, and acknowledgement of priestly influence were normalized. To laugh at a tale was acceptable, but to dismiss the underlying message could be considered folly. The myths became embedded in the cultural memory, influencing social behavior and personal decisions long after the original events had passed from living memory. In addition to reinforcing power, these legends provided a collective coping mechanism for the populace. Life in Sumer was often precarious, with unpredictable floods, harvest failures, and social pressures. Myths of priests' influence allowed people to frame these uncertainties within a comprehensible, ordered system. Success and failure were part of a moral and spiritual narrative, and the priests were the gatekeepers. The stories offered both explanation and instruction, allowing people to make sense of adversity, navigate social hierarchies, and maintain a cautious optimism that obedience and ritual observance could mitigate misfortune. Moreover, these stories ensured that the reputation of priests endured beyond the lifetimes of individual leaders. Even as kings rose and fell, wars reshaped city-states, and ordinary citizens lived and died, the collective memory of priestly authority persisted. Villages maintained oral histories recounting clever, fearsome, or wrathful priests, and these legends continued to shape social norms. The priesthood's authority was therefore not solely reliant on immediate power, but was reinforced culturally, psychologically, and morally through narrative. In this way, fear, respect, and caution were institutionalized, becoming part of the fabric of Sumerian life. Through these tales, priests became immortal in a sense. They were figures larger than life, operating at the intersection of myth, morality, and memory. Each story contributed to a tapestry in which the temple was central, the priesthood was indispensable, and the populace was perpetually reminded of the delicate balance between divine favor and human survival. The myths transmitted lessons, reinforced hierarchies, and embedded fear into culture, ensuring that reverence for priests remained ingrained for generations. Even those who never directly interacted with the temple understood, through stories, the consequences of defiance and the rewards of compliance. Ultimately, myths, legends, and whispered stories ensured that Sumerian priests were more than religious functionaries. They were symbols of order, power, and danger. Their influence reached into every household, market, and field, reinforced not just by action, but by the potent force of narrative. Citizens lived in a world in which obedience was a matter of life and death, where legends of cunning, wrath, and supernatural knowledge shaped perception and behavior, and where fear and reverence intertwined seamlessly. Through the careful cultivation of narrative memory, priests maintained their power, commanded respect, and ensured that their shadow endured far longer than their own lifetimes, shaping the lives and imaginations of generations to come. Even as the mighty city-states of Sumer faded from the pages of history, the shadow cast by the priesthood endured. Their temples crumbled, their ziggurats eroded by time and flood, yet the stories of their power, cunning, and fearsome influence continued to echo through the cultures that succeeded them. In every tale of divine wrath, mysterious ritual, or secret knowledge, one could trace the lingering influence of the Sumerian priests. They became archetypes, symbols of authority, both respected and resented, a cautionary reminder of the intertwined nature of spiritual, social, and political power. The legends of priests who commanded gods punished the unfaithful, and manipulated kings persisted, not because of the survival of written records alone, but because human memory and imagination preserved them, retelling and reshaping the tales across generations. Oral histories carried the echoes of temples long abandoned, of ceremonies once held under blazing sun, and flickering torchlight, of grain stores controlled by men who wielded knowledge as a weapon as much as a tool. Even after Sumerian political structures disintegrated, their priests' reputation survived in the myths and folklore of Mesopotamia's successor civilizations. Babylon, Assyria, and later cultures that rose along the Tigris and Euphrates absorbed fragments of Sumerian tradition, integrating them into new religious and administrative systems. Priests remained central figures, often imbued with the same aura of fear and respect that had defined their Sumerian predecessors. Scholars and scribes in Babylonian cities recorded omens and rituals strikingly reminiscent of Sumerian practices, often acknowledging the continuity of priestly authority. Through these channels, the archetype of the priest as a master of hidden knowledge, an intermediary between gods and mortals, and a wielder of both blessing and punishment endured. The stories of clever, ruthless, or mysterious priests became embedded in cultural consciousness, transmitted in clay tablets, temple inscriptions, and oral tradition alike, ensuring that the awe and dread inspired by their Sumerian forebears would not fade with the passage of centuries. This enduring reputation influenced how societies perceived power itself. Priests, as mediators of the divine, exemplified how knowledge and access could confer extraordinary influence. Subsequent rulers often relied on or feared religious intermediaries, understanding that the priestly class could manipulate the perception of authority. Stories of Sumerian priests who could curse, bless, or control the outcome of human events reinforced the lesson. Spiritual power could rival or even surpass temporal authority. These narratives were particularly potent in a world where literacy was rare and divine interpretation mattered more than codified law. Citizens who had once feared the wrath of a local priest now internalized the archetype of the cunning intermediary, shaping their interactions with the spiritual authorities of their own time. From Mesopotamia to neighboring regions, the concept of priests as both advisors and manipulators persisted, demonstrating the long-lasting impact of Sumerian practices on political and social structures. The cultural transmission of priestly fear also influenced literature, storytelling, and education. Tales of priests wielding secret knowledge, controlling destinies, and punishing those who defied divine authority became staples of morality narratives and cautionary fables. Young scribes, learning cuneiform and memorizing stories of gods and mortals, absorbed lessons on obedience, caution, and respect for those with knowledge beyond their own. Parents retold stories of priests' wrath during evening meals, emphasizing the consequences of disobedience. Festivals occasionally reenacted legendary rituals, symbolically reminding the populace of the intertwined fates of mortals and the divine. These practices ensured that even as civilizations changed and new deities or religious structures emerged, the Sumerian priesthood's psychological and cultural imprint remained strong. Fear, reverence, and acknowledgement of spiritual authority had become habitual, woven into the fabric of society. The reputational legacy of Sumerian priests also served as a warning for future elites. Kings and rulers learned from these stories that while religious authorities could legitimize their rule, they could also wield influence that might destabilize kingdoms. A king who ignored, humiliated, or attempted to bypass the priesthood risked losing the perception of divine favor, potentially undermining his authority. Conversely, a ruler who co-opted or allied with priests could consolidate power, using religious endorsement to strengthen political legitimacy. Tales of the priest's cunning and influence informed strategies of governance, illustrating that control over belief could be as consequential as control over armies or wealth. In this way, the myths of Sumerian priests extended beyond spiritual lessons, influencing governance, diplomacy, and social hierarchy for centuries. Even among common citizens, the archetype of the powerful, cunning, and occasionally terrifying priest persisted. Farmers, merchants, and artisans who had never interacted directly with the Sumerian priesthood absorbed stories of their influence through family, neighbors, and traveling storytellers. These narratives shaped everyday decisions, from the timing of offerings and prayers to the observance of festivals and rituals. Compliance was driven by more than faith alone. Fear of reprisal, whether divine or social, reinforced adherence to cultural norms. Through this psychological imprint, the Sumerian priesthood maintained a form of social control long after the physical structures of their society had disappeared. The invisible authority of the temple outlived the stone and mud brick buildings, as myth and memory acted as vessels for their enduring power. Legends of Sumerian priests also shaped the moral imagination of neighboring civilizations. The notion that individuals or groups could possess secret knowledge with the capacity to bless or curse was exported across trade routes and through cultural contact. Other civilizations adapted and reinterpreted these archetypes within their own religious and social frameworks, preserving the sense of awe and caution. Priests became symbols of both moral authority and potential corruption, representing a duality that fascinated, terrified, and guided communities. In art, ritual, and literature, these figures continued to serve as intermediaries, their Sumerian origins informing their perceived roles even as societies evolved. Across centuries, the fear and respect associated with priests became embedded in cultural psychology, influencing behaviors, institutions, and governance. Stories of Sumerian priests did more than inspire fear. They also served as enduring lessons about human ambition, morality, and the management of power. Tales recounted how priests used knowledge strategically, how secrecy could elevate status, and how divine authority could be invoked to enforce social norms. These narratives became reference points for leaders, educators, and spiritual guides, illustrating both the benefits and dangers of concentrated knowledge. They provided cautionary examples for those who might wield similar authority, demonstrating that influence without accountability could engender fear, resentment, and mythic reputation. In this way, the legacy of Sumerian priests transcended time, offering both guidance and warning to successive generations navigating the interplay between belief, power, and social cohesion. The reputation of Sumerian priests also shaped the psychology of belief. Communities internalized the idea that divine will was mediated by human authority, and that rituals, offerings, and obedience could directly affect outcomes in life and death. By extension, priests became both protectors and potential threats, embodying the uncertain relationship between humans and the divine. Through stories, the populace learned to navigate this uncertainty carefully, fostering respect and caution. The combination of awe, fear, and moral instruction embedded the priesthood in the social consciousness, ensuring that even as political structures fell, the symbolic and practical influence of priests endured. Myths of wrathful or cunning priests were repeated not merely as entertainment, but as vital tools for teaching social order, caution, and reverence. By the time Sumerian civilization had long vanished, the archetypal image of the priest persisted. Priests were imagined as both wise and dangerous, capable of controlling the unseen forces of nature and society. Their influence was a psychological legacy, shaping ideas of authority, morality, and spiritual accountability. The lessons conveyed through myth, legend, and cultural memory outlasted written records, ziggurats, and dynasties, demonstrating the profound impact of their societal role. Communities across Mesopotamia and beyond understood that priests embodied the delicate balance of knowledge, power, and fear, a balance that shaped human behavior, governance, and belief for centuries. In essence, the Sumerian priests left a legacy that transcended time. They became enduring symbols of authority, feared and respected, celebrated and vilified. Their influence felt long after the collapse of their civilization. Through myths, oral tradition, and cultural memory, they became exemplars of the potent combination of knowledge and power, demonstrating how fear and reverence could govern societies. Even modern scholarship acknowledges their profound role in shaping human understanding of religion, governance, and social order. The priest's shadow remained, a testament to the human capacity to remember, mythologize, and learn from the power wielded by those who once stood at the threshold between gods and mortals. As we close the chapter on the Sumerian priests, it becomes clear that their power extended far beyond the temples they commanded. They were not just religious figures, but architects of fear and influence, shaping the lives, laws, and beliefs of everyone around them. Their secrets, rituals, and divine claims left a mark so profound that even centuries later, echoes of their authority and cunning continue to resonate through history. From controlling kings to guiding commoners through life's uncertainties, the priests exemplified how knowledge, belief, and fear could combine to create enduring power. Their legacy is a reminder that authority, when intertwined with mystery and the unseen, can leave a shadow long after the structures that housed it have crumbled. If this journey through the hidden and fearsome world of Sumerian priests fascinated you, make sure to like this video to support the channel. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a dive into history's most gripping and terrifying stories. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Which part of the priest's power shocked you the most? Or what other ancient mysteries would you like to explore next? Every story we uncover together helps us understand not just the past, but the human nature that shaped it. Thank you for watching, and remember, history is full of secrets, and sometimes the shadows teach us the most.